Welcome to Eternal Dread, where fear never sleeps. Tell us where you're watching from and what time it is, because terror has no limits. If you're brave enough, share and comment, but beware, something might be watching you too. Now, turn off the lights and let the dread begin. I need help. My wife and I, both tired of the frantic pace of life back in the States, decided to move to Scotland 5 months ago. We found a small, weathered farmstead on the edge of a quiet town, the kind of place you see in postcards: rolling hills, fog creeping through the valleys, a patch of forest across the road. Everything seemed perfect at first. The people in town were friendly enough, the kind that wave when you pass them on the road, but there's something off. It's not the kind of thing you notice right away. It's the subtle things, the long, drawn-out silences at night. The way the wind sounds different here, like it's carrying whispers. I didn't notice it immediately. I was busy settling in, working on repairs around the property, getting used to the rhythms of the land. But over time, something started to bother me. It crept in, like an itch you can't scratch, until it was too much to ignore. It started with the dreams. At first, they seemed harmless. Vivid, sure, but harmless. In each one, I was running through the thick, dark forest across the road. My heart would race, and the world around me would pulse with an unnatural rhythm, like the very ground beneath my feet was alive. But then the dreams came more often, night after night. Each time they grew more real, more urgent. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, heart hammering in my chest, only to find myself lying in the same place I'd fallen asleep, the quiet of the house pressing in around me. One night, I had had enough. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, something was watching. So I left the warmth of my bed, pulled on my jacket, and went out onto the porch, trying to shake the restless feeling. The cold air hit me like a slap, but I didn't go back inside. I stood there for what felt like hours, staring across the road at the forest, the trees standing like silent sentinels in the moonlight. That's when I saw it, a shape just beyond the edge of the trees. A shadow that didn't belong. I don't know why I didn't tell Shelley right away. Shelley's my wife, by the way. She already felt so out of place here, so far from home. She'd taken to humming lately, and I feel like it's a nervous tic for her. I didn't want to make things worse for her, especially when I wasn't even sure what I'd seen. At that moment, I convinced myself it was nothing, just the shadows playing tricks, the kind of thing anyone might mistake for a person out of the corner of their eye. But it wasn't like I could just dismiss it, either. I mean, the forest across the road isn't exactly close. There's a stretch of yard between the house and the trees, and whatever I'd seen wasn't standing out on the road. It was deeper, further in, beyond the line where the trees start to swallow up the light. I'd also been having those bad dreams. And how could I trust my own eyes when I was barely sleeping, waking up in the middle of the night with my heart pounding? I didn't know what I had seen, but I didn't want to scare Shelley. Not when she already felt so displaced here. She might think I was losing it, but that was the way things were for a week or so. Pretty simple. Shelley and I settled into a routine. I worked from home, so my days were spent in front of a screen, responding to emails, writing reports, and the like. Shelley had inherited enough money that, as long as she kept some funds tucked away in index funds and didn't splurge on things we didn't need, we could live comfortably here. The farmstead was quiet, peaceful even. We had plans. We'd start small, make some repairs, and maybe get a few animals. The previous owners had goats and sheep, though the enclosures weren't in much better shape than the rest of the property. Most of the posts weren't even in the ground anymore, and a few of the stone fences were buckled and broken. I filled in the gaps where I could, but there was one spot, a stretch of old stone wall, that looked like it had been hit by a car. Still, the place was cheap. I had no complaints. The goal was early retirement, and we were on track. The slow, quiet life was exactly what we had envisioned. Then something happened to Blair. Blair was a nice enough girl, always smiling when she rode her red bicycle with the little basket in front, straight out of a movie. She lived a few properties down the road, and would pass by each afternoon on her way to work a shift at the local pub on the edge of town. She usually returned just past Shelley and I's bedtime, unless she got off early. We'd had our few nights out in town, chatted with her more than once. She was friendly, always waving and ringing her bike's bell as she pedaled by. It's a shame, really, what happened. I remember the last time I saw her. It was a Tuesday afternoon. I'd been working on the gateway to the property when I saw her ride by, her bike against traffic. The bend in the road is wide enough that I never really questioned why she'd ride closest to our home before deciding to switch back to the proper side. She rang her bell, waved, and said hi without slowing down much. But then I saw something as she pedaled past, something over her shoulder, dangling from a branch. A little pendant made of twigs, twine, and a dried flower. It reminded me of my dreams. I don't know why, but I walked over and took it down. It wasn't even on my property, but it gave me the creeps. A sense of something not right, as if it radiated malice, though I couldn't explain why. That night, I was woken by a shriek, piercing, frantic, pulling me from sleep. My heart was racing. I bolted upright, my mind scrambled. I went to the kitchen, stepped toward the window, and looked out. There it was, the silhouette. I didn't go back to sleep. Blair didn't ride by the next afternoon, or the next, or the one after that. This didn't sit well with me for the following nights. Daytime felt fine, though it was the kind of fine where you just feel safer when the sun is up and the shadows haven't crept in yet. But eventually, the police showed up at our door, asking if we'd seen anything. That was the first time Shelley heard about my dreams, and also the first time I felt the sting of ridicule. The officers pointed and laughed as I told them about the shriek in my dream, how I woke up and saw the silhouette outside through the window. They didn't take me seriously. It sounded valid enough. Blair had lived alone in an apartment, and there was nothing to suggest foul play. She could have just packed up and left after her shift, the way some people do when they get the urge to start over. Aside from her boss doing a wellness check, no one else seemed overly concerned. With my suspicions brushed aside, Shelley seemed to relax. We decided to have a drink in Blair's memory, to toast our good neighbor who maybe, possibly, had just run away. I wish I hadn't drunk so much. By the time we got home, I was tipsy enough to stagger, and Shelley was far beyond that. I shouldn't have driven. But aside from my terrible parking job, no real harm was done. We stumbled into the house, too drunk to care about anything else, and fell asleep quickly. But in my dreams, things had changed. The pulsing now danced in red and blue at the edges of my vision, like neon lights flickering in time with my heart. This time, I wasn't in the forest. I walked toward it from my own home. In the distance, a lute played, soft, lilting, and strange, carried on the wind. It wasn't the song itself, but the whistle that followed it, a tuneful, rhythmic whistle that drew me in like a melody I should know. I reached the road, and that's when I heard it, a woman's giggle, light and playful. I crossed the street, shoving branches aside as I swayed into the forest. Even though I'd peered into it countless times, every time the light seemed to disappear the moment I got close, swallowed up by the trees. But not this time. The moonlight broke through the canopy, and it led me to a circle, a ring of small stones, moss, and mushrooms, glowing faintly in the pale light. Inside the circle, a young woman danced, graceful, hypnotic. She seemed so familiar. Shelley? No, it wasn't her. But as I tried to focus on her, my vision blurred, and the figure was shrouded in shadow. And that's when I saw it. A bike. A red bike, just beyond the woman, leaning against a tree. The same red bike Blair had ridden. The same basket, and the same little bell. My heart pounded. I glanced back at the woman, and the instant my eyes met where hers would have been, something happened. Her neck snapped to an unnatural angle. Her arms dropped to her sides, and her wrists tilted in such a way that her fingers, her nails, pointed straight at me, like they were attack vectors, ready to strike. The sound of a lute string snapping echoed in the dream, and that was when my body went into full prey mode. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to escape, but my legs wouldn't move. That was for less than a second. It felt like an eternity, though. I violently pivoted, my body sluggish, weighed down by the alcohol, before I lurched into a drunken sprint. The pulsing in my head grew, as if the rhythm were tearing through the soles of my feet. Thumping echoed behind me. Vibration. Branches cracking under the weight of something much bigger than I could imagine. This couldn't be Blair. No, that wasn't her. The figure in the forest, there's no way that was her. I crashed into trees, my shoulders scraping against rough bark. I hadn't wandered this deep into the forest. But I could see it now, the road just a little further. The thumping grew louder, the air hot and foul, pressing against my back. My skin crawled, my heart hammered, feeling as though it might catch fire from the terror flooding through me. I reached the road, stumbled into the ditch, and collapsed. My knees buckled under me, and the drunkenness I had managed to escape during the sprint came rushing back in full force. I hit the ground face first, but I forced myself onto my back, panic driving me to scramble for some defense, to prepare myself for whatever was chasing me. And that's when I saw it. A little girl. in the trillium, stopped and stared right at me, next to something much larger. The thing I had seen before. But now, next to the girl, it was massive. Trollish. Ogreish. Dark, oppressive shadow cloaked them both. My heart stopped, and my vision blackened. And then I woke up. 6 a.m. What a terrible dream. Shelley still looked angelic, lying beside me, sound asleep. I rolled over, desperate to bury myself in the warmth of slumber, finally convinced that I was safe. But then I saw it. Mud. Tracked in through the door. I could see it from the kitchen, all the way up to the bed. My boot prints. My boot prints? Pain shot through my shoulders and my knees ached. My back burned, stiff as a board. Grass stains on my palms. Dirt under my fingernails. Shelley woke up before I could finish cleaning the mess. It didn't take much for her to convince herself that I'd gotten too drunk the night before and stumbled outside before we went to bed. She scolded me, made me promise never to drive in that state again. I nodded, although I hadn't really been listening. Her reasoning seemed sound enough, that in my drunken stupor, I must have wandered outside, tracking in mud before collapsing into bed. And maybe she was right. I was well past buzzed, to say the least. But something gnawed at me as I patrolled the yard. The ground around the house was solid, dry except for the usual morning dew. We hadn't had any storms lately, no rain to soften the dirt into mud. I had reasonable doubt that whatever was smeared across the floor had come from our property. Then there was the gate. Just past the old iron gate at the front of our land, 2 clumps of upturned grass disrupted the otherwise undisturbed earth between the stone fence and the ditch. Proof that I'd fallen there. I could picture it too clearly, staggering breathless, tripping over my own feet, landing hard. But if that was true, how had I made it back inside? And why couldn't I remember getting up? Honey, the pie's ready, come back inside. What? Even looking back, I can't believe I was so lost in my own head that I hadn't noticed Shelley was baking. I couldn't even tell you how long I'd been pacing outside that day. Rhubarb and juniper pie. If you haven't had it, you should. Back in Pennsylvania, we rarely saw juniper berries in the markets. But here, they were everywhere, growing wild along the trails, sold fresh at every farmer's market. Shelley had taken to them quickly, experimenting in the kitchen, turning them into something sweet, something familiar. The pie didn't make me forget, but for a little while it grounded me. And really, wasn't everything fine? The house was warm. The days passed quietly. Aside from the nightmares, nothing had happened. I told myself that over and over. Shelley was happy. She came home from town in high spirits, chatting about little things, the baker's new scones, the neighbor's new dog. Meanwhile, I had been dampening our home's energy with my suspicions, with my paranoia. Maybe that was all it was, adjusting to a new place. Maybe the tension, the unease, the sense of something lurking, maybe it was just me. The following days, no dreams, no strange noises, no Blair, just wonder. Wonder turned into dismissal, and dismissal turned me toward forgetting it all. Until this week. My mood had lifted. The nights were silent. The house felt like ours again. I focused on finishing the stone fence out front, salvaging old rocks from a collapsed section of wall deeper in the property. The work was satisfying, almost meditative. With each stone I set in place, it felt like I was putting something behind me. Until I found it. I was wedging a large rock into the top of the fence when I heard another stone shift, a dry, scraping sound, just a few feet away. I paused. A loose stone. My natural prey. I nudged a few with my boot, and one moved too easily. Loose. Smiling to myself, proud of my manly blue-collar senses. Guys who work on computers can be handy too. I pried it free, ready to set it with fresh mortar. And there it was. A small pendant, nestled deep in a pocket between the stones. Twigs twisted together, bound in fraying twine. A dried flower, brittle and colorless, woven into the center. Not truly colorless, rowan, long past its bloom, a cream-white husk of what it had been. This wasn't lost or forgotten. Someone had placed it there. Hid it. The edges of the stone were too precise, too deliberate. I could see the raw scrape of metal against rock, pale and dustless. I knew this fence. I had been working on it all day. Nothing kept the weather out, not the damp, not the wind. And yet, the hollow where the pendant rested was fresh. If it had been there long, rain and time would have taken their toll. It should have been blackened with rot, disintegrating into the dirt. It wasn't. I reached in. The moment my fingers touched it, the air shifted. A gust of wind swept through. Not a natural breeze, but a single, deliberate push of air that curled around me. lifting the fine hairs on my arms. I froze. There, riding on the wind, was a sound. A whistle. High and thin, almost tuneful, deliberate. Too deliberate. It didn't come from the trees or the distant road. It came from nowhere. From everywhere. Something inside me recoiled. My gut tightened like I'd swallowed ice water. Then, just as fast, my fear burned away, smothered under something hotter. Anger. I was tired of this. Tired of the tricks, the whispers in the dark, the things just outside my sight line. Whatever game this was, I was done playing. I didn't take it inside. I wouldn't. Instead, I carried it far out back and threw it, hard, into the underbrush. Let the woods have it. Let whoever put it there come and get it. I could even feel like they were watching. The hairs on the back of my neck, raising, just for me to pat them back down. I dusted off my hands, turned toward the road, and started walking. I was going to our neighbor's house. I needed answers. By the time I reached the Aikens property, the sun was leaping from its peak, pressing heat into my shoulders, soon to set. Stuart and Elsie were always welcoming. They'd hosted Shelley and me once together, then Shelley plenty more times on her own. My visit was met with the usual warmth, right up until I asked about the Fultons, which, honestly, wasn't long past our greetings. I'd planned to ease into it, to start slow and ramp up the questioning so I wouldn't sound insane. But the moment I mentioned the last family to own my house, the atmosphere shifted. Subtle but undeniable. Stuart and Elsie stiffened, their easy smiles tightening. "Well, what do you need to know about them?" Stuart said. "They aren't coming back." "What? What?" Elsie shot him a look, then quickly softened her voice. "What Stuart means is, well, there's not much of a legacy to them, and they shouldn't concern you. Not reassuring. Not even close." I pressed. "What's that supposed to mean? Are they?" "Yes." Stuart cut in, then hesitated. "Kind of. Wah. Isla's been missing. Alexander is most definitely dead." Something heavy settled in my gut. My thoughts scrambled to piece together questions faster than I could ask them. Stuart must have seen it on my face because he exhaled and continued before I could interrupt. "Alex and Isla were good neighbors. A little odd, but happy. Moved in 7 years ago, no fuss. Always friendly. Isla especially. She used to stop by often." His voice softened for a second, like the memory was bittersweet. "Things only got strange in the months before Isla disappeared." Elsie folded her hands in her lap. Neither of them looked at me now. "She told us Alex wasn't sleeping," Stuart went on. "Not just trouble sleeping, wasn't sleeping at all. Some nights she'd wake up and he was gone. But he always went to bed with her. Always woke up beside her. She thought maybe he was sneaking out because of money trouble. She never got an answer." He rubbed his thumb over the edge of the table, thoughtful. "The week she stopped coming around," he said, "the police visits started." My mouth was dry. "Alex was clean," Stuart said. "Not a single person believed he hurt her. You have to understand, he wouldn't. They weren't just some new couple who moved in. They grew up here. Childhood sweethearts. That house was their first home together." Stuart exhaled sharply, then stood and walked to the far window. He pulled back the curtain, revealing a small, familiar shape tucked on the sill. A pendant. Twigs, twine, and a dried rowan flower. The same damn thing I found in my fence. "Wards," Stuart said. He picked it up, rolling it between his fingers. "Alex gave us a bunch of them. Told us to tuck them around our homes. Said the forest took Isla. Said it took his wife. And before he left, he told us to keep the wards up." My skin prickled. "Left?" I asked. Stuart's fingers went still against the twine. He said he was going to get her. He placed the ward back on the sill, then crossed the room to another window. This time, he pulled the curtain back and gestured outside. "Last time we saw him," he said, nodding toward the bend in the road near my house, "was that night." I stepped closer and followed his gaze. A couple 100 yards away, just past the curve, lay the treeline. The forest's edge, dark even now, with the noon sun glaring overhead. The wind barely stirred the branches. "It was clear that night," Stuart continued, voice quieter now. "No moon. No clouds. Just stars." He exhaled through his nose. "We watched him walk in right there, lantern in hand. Never saw him come back out." Something inside me sank. "They found him the next week," Stuart finally said. "His parents went to check on him. Guessed through everything, he'd never missed his Wednesday call with his ma." He let out a slow, weighted breath. "Coroner said heart attack, but he was in his bed. On his side of the bed, looking up at the ceiling, arms at his sides. Fully dressed. Mud on his boots." I swallowed. We keep the wards up, Stuart said, voice low. He looked down at the one in his palm, frowning. Just in case. Stuart opened his mouth to say more, but I cut him off. I shouldn't have even let him speak as long as he had, not after realizing what I'd done. What I'd taken down. The wards. They had been separating my house, my wife, from whatever was in the forest. My stomach clenched. I need to leave. Now. Please, can I have one of those wards? Elsie looked like she was about to protest, lips parting with the kind of words people say to reassure themselves more than anyone else. That I wouldn't need it. That Alex had lost his mind. That it was just a story, just superstition. But Stuart knew. He raised a hand, silencing her before a single syllable could escape. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in the way his gaze lingered on me. A weight, a quiet understanding, like he had been waiting for this. With a small nod of his head, he gestured toward a drawer. Elsie hesitated, then opened it. Inside, lying in a thin layer of dust, were 3 more of those brittle little charms, twigs bound in knotted twine, flowers long dead. They must have been sitting, forgotten yet deliberately kept. I didn't wait. I grabbed them and turned for the door, my pulse a dull roar in my ears. I had to get home. I had to get them back up. Before sunset. As I stepped off the porch, I heard it. The soft, deliberate click of the Aiken's door latching shut. And then the lock turning. I must have looked like a madman, sprinting straight for the house. I didn't care. I needed time. As much as I could steal before the light bled from the sky and darkness took its place. Cutting through the yard, my breath ragged, I caught movement, a figure in the window. Shelley. She passed by the bedroom window upstairs, the soft glow of the lamp outlining her familiar shape as the sun began to lower itself beneath the other side of our home. Relief crashed over me so hard I nearly stumbled. She was safe. Here. Home. Unaware of the wards I had torn down. Unaware of what I had let in. But relief was fleeting. Urgency took its place. I didn't slow down. I couldn't. I barreled through the front door, barely remembering to close it behind me before rushing to the windows. One by one, I placed the wards, my hands shaking as I set them on the sills. They felt too small, too fragile. Would they even be enough? Above me, Shelley moved across the floorboards, the creak of her steps steady and light, humming a tune I almost recognized. Familiar, reassuring. But there was one more ward. I had to find it. Without stopping to catch my breath, I tore back outside, the last remnants of daylight stretching long and thin over the grass. The sun was almost gone. I ran. To the back. To where I had thrown it. I found it faster than I expected, almost as if it had been waiting for me. Snatching it from the grass, I didn't hesitate. I sprinted back, my pulse hammering in my ears. The sky had darkened just that much more, shadows stretching and swallowing the last light. I nearly slammed into the front door as I stumbled inside and closed it behind me, heart still pounding. I recouped for 30 seconds or so, catching my breath. And then the handle turned. The front door creaked open a few moments later, and there was Shelley, standing in the doorway, holding a little woven basket full of juniper berries. Her face was flushed from the cold, strands of hair falling loose around her cheeks. I shoved the ward into my pocket, forcing my breath to steady. She giggled. "Well, what had you running like that, you goof?" Her smile was warm, teasing. "Couldn't even hold the door for your wife." I blinked. She wasn't home. "I thought you'd been inside," I said quickly, covering the rush of unease creeping up my spine. "That's my bad, darling." I pulled her into a hug, burying my face in the warmth of her neck, breathing her in. She smelled earthy, crisp, with the faint bite of juniper. She leaned back slightly, brushing her fingers through my hair. "I told you I was going out to pick berries today. Didn't I do good?" Her voice was soft, sweet, but something about the way she said it made my stomach twist. I had heard her. Upstairs. Humming. Walking. Moving through the house. I swallowed hard, tightening my arms around her just a little. "You did so good, honey." I forced myself to let go. Forced myself to act normal. "Be right back," I murmured, stepping away. I slipped around the corner, pulling the ward from my pocket. Like a burglar, I crept up the stairs, my pulse in my throat, holding the ward out in front of me like some kind of idiot. I swept each room as if I were clearing a house in a war zone. Nothing. Closet clear. Bathroom clear. Hallway clear. My muscles loosened, but only slightly. Then from downstairs, "Honey, are you done hiding from your wife now?" Her voice was sing-song, playful. I exhaled, forcing the tension from my body. Yes, I am. I ducked into our bedroom, knelt down, and slipped the final ward under the bed, right beneath her side. Extra protection. The rest of the evening passed peacefully. We curled up together on the couch, watching Bob's Burgers while the rich, earthy scent of juniper pie filled the house. That should have been the end of it. But I wouldn't be writing this now if not for the dream. It started with me waking up, sitting straight up in bed. The sheets beside me were cold. Empty. A giggle drifted through the room, soft, familiar, wrong. My head snapped toward the door just in time to see Shelley's bare feet disappear around the frame. Jolted, I threw the covers off and followed. The wooden floor was cold against my feet as I stepped into the hall, catching the faintest sound. Bare feet slapping softly against the stairs. She was heading down. I reached the landing just as the front door groaned open. I rushed to pull my shoes on, the laces tangling under trembling fingers. When I finally looked up, she was already outside, skipping, dancing, drifting, straight toward the trees. The moment I crossed the threshold, the dream shifted. The moonlight dimmed. The sky felt too low. My vision tunneled, narrowing toward the trees as though the house behind me no longer existed. The closer I got to the woods, the louder her humming became. And then the lute, a melody, plucked softly from the shadows, rising to meet her song. I stepped past the brush, and there it was. A small ring of stones, moss, and mushrooms, glowing faintly in the pale light. My stomach turned to ice. At its center sat a juniper shrub, half-picked clean. A string on the lute snapped with a sharp, jarring twang, and I woke up, next to no one. The bed was empty. The house was silent. I rushed downstairs, my pulse still hammering from the dream. And there, on the kitchen table, was a note. Went to drop off the pie at Stu and Elsie's. I'll be back around noon, baby. Signed, Shelley. That's not right. That's not right. She doesn't spell her name like that. A slow, creeping chill spread through my chest. I turned the paper over in my hands, searching for anything else, something to explain why my skin was crawling. But the handwriting was perfect. Too perfect. Like it was trying to be natural. Trying to be her. I swallowed hard and turned on my heel, bolting back up the stairs. I dropped onto my hands and knees beside the bed, hard in my throat. I lifted the bed skirt. The ward was gone. A sharp wave of nausea rolled through me. My mouth was dry, my hands clammy as I pressed my palm to the floorboards, scanning for something, anything. And then I saw it. Faint, nearly invisible against the wood. The smallest outline of a footprint. Dry mud, barely more than a smudge, as if someone had carefully wiped it away. Almost perfectly. She almost had me. It's 10 a.m. right now. I need ideas, guys. What do I do? Tom went mad, Gilbert said. Schizophrenia or something, I think. He stopped leaving the place completely. After a month of being pent up inside, he died of starvation. He was a hoarder. A serious one. It took weeks to get the home cleaned up, and even then there's still some junk in the basement the cleaners left there. I'd be curious to have a look and see if there's anything valuable. He snorted. I doubt it though. I sorted through what remained of the clutter and determined most of it to be worthless. There were shelves full of dusty tools and stacks of used furniture. Shoved up against the wall was a large mattress with dirty, stained sheets and old clothes piled on top of it. There was one thing I uncovered, which did catch my attention. In the far back corner of the basement, something was hidden underneath a white sheet. A chest, turned back to face the wall. Within the chest, I discovered a diary and a stack of paintings. I skimmed through the diary first. Below, I've copied out some of the stranger entries as I read them. I had one of the oddest experiences of my life today. It started with a dream. From what I could recall, I was fleeing from something. I don't remember what it looked like. I know it was huge on a cosmic scale, and it wasn't supposed to exist. I'm not sure if that makes sense, but describing the thing at all is difficult for me. I woke up from the dream with my head throbbing and sweat covering my body. My throat was dry and raw. My ears were ringing. Something felt wrong. When I went outside the following morning, what I saw was bizarre. It looked like a bolt of lightning had struck the ground at the edge of the stretch of hayfields extending past my backyard. The immediate section of corn was blackened and withered, the corn further out a sickly brown color. In the center of the circle of scorched earth sat a hand-sized stone totem. 4 uncanny faces decorated each of its sides. They appeared almost but not quite human. 2 were screaming, the other 2 bore grins which extended unnaturally wide. The piece of stone was stained on one side with a blotch of reddish brown. The previous homeowner took the totem back to his house and put it in the basement. The next couple of entries deliberated over various other aspects of his life. I was intrigued enough to keep skimming through the diary, and my curiosity was soon rewarded. Something happened to one of my paintings. I'm writing this down to help me understand it. I have owned the painting for years. It has been here since before my parents moved in. It's the type of thing you live with for such a long time you never really notice it. Yet now every time I sit in the room with it, I swear I can feel the painting watching me. He went on to describe the painting. An old man sitting on a table with a walking stick in one hand, the other holding a pair of spectacles up to his eyes. When he had examined it closer, Tom noticed something about the painting had changed. The man looks different. He looks scared, and there is a long, tall shadow in the shadows behind him, only barely visible, but it's definitely there. After a couple days, I took it off the wall and put it away in the basement. That was when I noticed the idol had fallen off the shelf it had been sitting on. It has shattered into several pieces. The idol no longer gave off the sense of malice it did when I found it. But that's not to say the feeling has gone, it hasn't. I went back down to the basement. I checked on both the remains of the idol and the watercolor painting. I previously described my discomfort being around the portrait of the old man, but that instinct is gone now. The painting itself appears normal again. Just an old man staring at the viewer with an expression suggesting him to be deep in thought. Upstairs I have a couple of other portraits hanging up around my house. One is of a little waterfall in a forest. Now out of the corner of my eye I swear I can see something staring out at me from in between two trees within the painting. I thought it had to be my imagination, but when I succumbed to paranoia and took a closer look I realized it wasn't. When I peered close enough I caught the shadow of something tall in the trees, hunched over to the side at an odd and unnatural angle. More of the portraits in my house have been changed. These changes are both subtle and unnerving. What is stranger is that when one painting changes, the others change back. The shadow of the thing inside the waterfall painting has disappeared. I want to know if what is going on here can be explained rationally. And if it can't, I want to understand what the hell this thing is haunting me. I've thought about it, and I believe getting rid of the remains would be wisest. I can't emphasize enough how uncomfortable it is to share a house with it. The thing possessing my paintings, which must be somehow connected to the fetish. I hate being around the paintings once they've changed. They're not so bad after they've changed back, but whichever painting possesses the visual anomalies feels alive. Not just alive, but hostile. I honestly feel like the thing inside the paintings despises me. I'm not overly superstitious, but I'd be an idiot to deny there was something evil about the idol I discovered out there. Getting rid of the idol didn't work. Getting rid of all of the paintings I've spotted changes and didn't work. It keeps switching between other portraits all around the house. The most recent one it took possession of is a landscape portrait of a small, old-fashioned neighborhood from the 1930s. Something is staring out at me through one window, no more than a hazy blur in the grayness of the glass. I took it down and put it away with the other ones. The following entries described how it moved from one image to another. Tom subsequently developed a phobia of being around portraits and avoided them religiously, going as far as to lock every painting he owned away in his basement. His entries became less and less coherent. He discussed how his world was falling apart. The account he wrote painted a sad picture of a depressed and lonely man who needed help but didn't know how or where to get it. I could hardly make sense of the last couple entries. They read like the ramblings of a madman. I wasn't surprised since Gilbert told me he had been diagnosed with multiple mental illnesses in the years leading up to his death. Tom scoured his house repeatedly looking for paintings. He claimed to discover different pictures hanging off of his walls every couple of weeks. It became a daily ritual to check his house to make sure no new ones had appeared. He was convinced something awful would happen if the wraith, as he had begun calling it, was left outside of his basement for too long. This was where the readable part of the journal ended. The remaining entries were impossible to make sense of. I took the journal upstairs and sorted through the paintings. They were the same ones the author described. The one at the bottom of the pile was a depiction of a procession of gaunt soldiers from what looked to be WW2, trudging over the remains of a weathered battleground. The soldiers' eyes were fearful and haunted, their faces stark white. This photo scared me in an inexplicable way. The longer I looked at it, the more mad and deranged the faces of the soldiers appeared. The sensation I felt while around it mirrored the one the author had described, a steadily growing sense of uneasiness which made it difficult to gaze upon the painting for too long. One of the first things I did with the portrait was take a photo of it on my phone. Tom had done the same thing a couple of times previously and made a dubious claim. According to him, the effects the portrait had on him didn't extend to photos of it, no matter how many he took. He was right. The portrait looked distinctly different on camera. The faces of the soldiers appeared more grim rather than haunted, and the one furthest to the back of the procession wasn't grinning in a deranged way the way he was in the original picture. I took a couple more photographs, still not quite able to believe it, but they all showed the same thing. At a housewarming party, I showed the war portrait to some friends. They each shared my discomfort when they looked at it. Some of them didn't get the feeling of dread I described immediately, but one by one they each succumbed to it. When I showed them the photos, they confirmed the differences I noticed were real. They complimented me on my photo editing skills, and I had to explain to them that I didn't do any of this. When I proved the fact by taking another photograph, one of my friends came up with an interesting theory. He suggested a special kind of paint could have been used to make the painting appear different in the light of the camera as a picture was being taken. Keen to get to the bottom of the mystery, I began testing some of the other claims made by Tom in his diary. I placed the WW2 portrait next to a collection of creepy photos I'd found online and printed out. The first time it happened was with a photo of a pale, angular face leering out of a dark background. I couldn't say precisely when it occurred, but the wraith took possession of the photo. What had once been a piece of paper with a generic scary image printed on it was now a dark, almost oppressive presence lying on my desk beside me. Something else happened, too. The WW2 portrait changed subtly. The soldiers' faces now looked like they did in the photos I took of the portrait. It worked just as Tom had described in his journal. Whenever I wasn't looking directly at one of the photos, I could swear the face in it had turned around to stare at me. I frequently looked to check this wasn't the case, but this did little to curb my anxiety. The effect of the photos seemed to be cumulative over time, the longer the wraith inhabited one photograph. It began as a persistent and intrusive feeling of uneasiness. The longer I spent around the photographs, the more they troubled me. The white, angular face began showing up in the corner of my eye. I began to understand why Tom spoke of the portraits the way he did, and why he hid so many of them away in the basement. If I shared the same room as the wraith, I couldn't bring myself to remain turned away from it for too long, or to look at it for too long either. And I wasn't the only one who felt that way. My friends all shared the same sentiment. Once we played a game to see who could look at one of the possessed photos for the longest. The best of us lasted 9 minutes before shuddering, turning away and leaving the room. There were things the wraith could do which Tom never learned about, but I did. All of what I'd seen so far was only the beginning of what the wraith was capable of. One rainy day, when I was stuck on a class assignment, I elected to take a break and went out to get a coffee. When I came back, I noticed something looking back at me from my computer screen which hadn't been there before. It didn't take me long to pick out the subtle differences in the photo on my screen and deduce what had happened. The wraith had transferred itself onto my computer. What I was looking at was a digital copy of the same leering face I showed you earlier. No copy I made of the image file replicated the cognitive effects of the possessed image or the visual differences the wraith had made to it. Modifying the image itself didn't do anything at first. When I changed it too much, the wraith abandoned the image and reattached itself to another one in the same folder. I put another image into a parent directory, deleted the possessed one, and waited for a response. I didn't have to wait long. The wraith did what I'd predicted it would do, moving to the image in the other directory. A couple of days later, I managed to get it inside of a GIF. The image depicted a girl standing and staring at her reflection. The animated loop was of the reflection leaning forward and beginning to push its face into the other side of the mirror. The wraith added an extra second to the end of the GIF, showing the reflection melting through the glass on the girl's side of the mirror while reaching out for her. This difference was disturbing enough on its own, but I could have sworn the GIF was changing a little more each time it played on my screen. From time to time, the GIF would pop up on screen unprompted, stuck in its ceaseless repetition. I began to feel a vague sense of dread while using my computer, as I feared another occurrence of the wraith flashing up on my screen. It was a stupid thing to be scared of, but I struggled to shake the feeling off. Recently, I'd watched a slasher flick, and I decided to see if the wraith would interact with it. Like with the other media, there were tangible differences in the possessed version of the film. The murder scenes were more graphic and lasted longer. The movie concluded with a 10-second shot of the murderer staring into the camera expressionlessly, with no music or noise. Upon watching the movie for a second time, several more scenes played out where various characters stopped, fell silent, and stared into the screen as the murderer had done. The movie mutated further each time I watched it. Scenes became glitched, and the subtitles turned into an incomprehensible jumble of characters from a language I couldn't identify. After showing the movie to my friends, they were as unable as I was to explain what they saw. They had seen enough to be convinced the wraith was real, even if I wasn't so sure of the fact myself. However, none of us were scared by the idea. We were fascinated. We were debating what it meant when one of them brought up an intriguing suggestion. This little group of ours was in the middle of working on a horror game. It was a passion project the five of us, George, me, Nick, Hayden, and Matthew, had envisioned during our first year together at college. The wraith can inhabit all kinds of media, George said, leaning in. What if it could inhabit a video game? At his urging, I moved the possessed movie file into the game folder on my computer. When this didn't have an effect, I deleted the file the wraith had possessed. It turned up in an image file again, this time a texture within the game. The game we were working on was an exploration of a large, liminal landscape. There was little story or background, just wandering through an eerie world with an atmosphere inspired by titles ranging from the old Silent Hill games to Active Worlds. Even though little in the game had been tangibly changed, playing it was a totally different experience. There was an unshakable sense something was hidden in the game with us. Something which wasn't supposed to be there. George in particular was blown away by what the game had become. He got it into his head that we had to find a way to put the wraith into all copies of the game. Then we would release the game, and everyone would get to experience what we did while playing it. He was certain it would be a massive success if we could achieve this. He went as far as to claim it might end up being one of the most successful indie horror titles of all time. I brought up the significant issue with his plan. There could only be a single copy of the haunted game. My friends could only experience the game like I did when they played it on my computer. Streaming or otherwise recording the game couldn't effectively recapture the effect playing it had. He suggested running the game files through a special program to create duplicates of the wraith. Though it seemed like a dubious prospect to me, I agreed to transfer the file onto a USB drive to give to him. He was convinced he could pull it off, and his excitement at the idea was contagious. For the next couple of months, George dedicated himself to development of the game. The work he did during this time was impressive. In one live stream, he toured us through a life-sized sports stadium and a fully furnished shopping mall. He wanted the experience of the game to be unique for everyone who played it. For this, he had decided to make the world procedurally generated. It was an overly ambitious goal, but George was adamant he could pull it off, and he already had the code to prove it. The progress he'd made was great, but it wasn't what we cared about. We wanted to hear about what he'd done with the wraith. George admitted he was struggling to control the thing. It was skipping through files in the game too fast for him to keep track of. He assured us he would get on top of the issue and fulfill his promise. We just needed to be patient. George was a binge worker. He was typically either procrastinating or feverishly working on something. We were used to seeing him worn out after staying up late completing an assignment the night before it was due. I bring this up to explain why we weren't initially concerned when we noticed the way George looked during classes. We did get a bit worried when he started skipping classes and missed a pair of exams. That concern evolved into worry when Nick overheard he'd bailed out on a family reunion. We reached out to him. He admitted his insomnia had come back. He tried to play it all off like it wasn't a big deal and promised us he intended to see a doctor. 2 weeks later, George shared with us another milestone in the game's development. The Stalker was a new idea George had added into the game. It would come out after a certain amount of time had elapsed in-game. The Stalker was supposed to be a physical manifestation of the feeling of something hidden just behind every corner and lurking beyond the walls of fog that the wraith elicited. We were a little peeved he'd updated the game in such a major way without consulting with any of us. We might have argued about it, however George was the lead developer of the game and currently the only one working on it at the time. Over the course of the 2-hour live stream, he wandered the empty landscapes of the game searching for the Stalker, and we sat watching him. For the first 30 minutes, he traversed a metropolis full of stone-still figures, staring out of windows from buildings rising unnaturally far into the sky. He wandered around a town square with an oversized, circular fountain where every building was obscured by a dense layer of stagnant mist. The creepy atmosphere of the game was offset by banter between us as we watched him play. Yet there was only so long we could fill the void of silence as George roamed restlessly around the empty world. He remained uncomfortably quiet, hardly responding to our attempts to start a conversation, and he became more irritable each time we tried to talk to him. "I think I see it," George announced over the live stream suddenly. I didn't see anything. Neither did any of the other viewers who were still tuned in. His avatar had stopped and was staring off toward the slope of a hill upon which a single lonely skyscraper rose into the sky. His next comment came after another minute of silence. "I keep walking toward this thing, but it doesn't seem like I'm getting any closer. It has turned around, I think." His avatar wasn't moving at all. He hadn't moved since he claimed to have seen the stalker. There was another pause. "You see it, don't you?" We all agreed that we could see nothing. "I see its face." "Bloody hell, there's something wrong with it. It's..." The live stream continued for a while with George's avatar staring off into the depths of the gray gloom. We didn't hear another word from him. After a full day of no contact from George, the first went over to his place to check on him in person. George laughed his behavior off, telling me he'd felt a little sick and decided to take a break. He refused to acknowledge how strangely he'd been acting during the live stream. He couldn't remember seeing the stalker at all, and he couldn't remember how the live stream ended. Following this incident, George began to deteriorate more rapidly. His insomnia got worse. You could see signs of it whenever he bothered attending class. He started nodding off frequently. He was always staring off into space with a dull look in his eyes, hardly acknowledging the world going on around him. George had started a blog a year prior as a game dev diary to keep the small community of fans the game had attracted up to date on its progress. By that time, it had become the main way he communicated with the outside world. "I'm sorry for all the delays in releasing the alpha. Development has been complicated by bugs and some other personal issues going on in my life. A lot of you have been asking, who is the stalker? I've been thinking about this a lot recently, deliberating over whether it's better to leave it a mystery for the player to imagine, or if I should give a backstory to uncover as they explore. I would appreciate your input on this. I'm hoping to release an update to the demo to show off some of the new stuff I've patched in. I'm looking for playtesters. Tell me you hate the game if you want. I just want to hear some honest input from people. I had a dream last night. In the dream, I was wandering around in circles inside a city. It soon dawned on me that I was stuck inside the game. The stalker was there. It took off its face as if it were some kind of mask. What I saw after that frightened me enough to run like hell away from it. I wish I could tell you what it was I saw, but all I can recall is a haze. I kept running until I couldn't anymore. When I stopped and checked behind me, the stalker was gone. Then somehow I was back where I began my journey. I started to walk again for whatever reason. As is the case many times in dreams, I was unable to control my own actions. Later I found myself at the tall building where I first saw the stalker, and the events of the dream repeated themselves. I was confronted with the entity again. It took off its face, and I saw what lay beneath. And I ran in terror. This cycle repeated over and over. Each time the entity revealed itself as something horrifying, though once again, I can't remember its appearance. I couldn't tell you if it had a different face each time or the same one. The dream lasted an uncomfortably long time. It was longer than any other dream I've ever had. When I woke up from it, I felt as exhausted as if I had spent the whole night awake. I have these dreams every night. They last so long and they seem too real. When I wake up from them, I feel as if I haven't slept at all. I find it increasingly difficult to focus during the day, and I've become accustomed to feeling maddeningly tired all the time. I didn't know it was possible to want to sleep so badly, and yet find it so bloody hard to get any proper rest. The sleeping pills aren't working anymore. I take them anyway. I'm very dependent on them, and I don't have the energy to deal with the side effects of quitting. At least they make me feel a little less crappy for a while. Weeks passed before another update was made. I think there were a pair of deleted posts written during the period, but I couldn't recover them. Here is the last thing he ever posted. "Hi everyone. I need to focus on my mental health for a while. I will be pausing work on game development for now. I'm sorry for all of you who expected a release soon. I can't say when an alpha is going to arrive, or if I'm ever going to pick up this game again, to be honest. For anyone still tuned in, this is goodbye. For now." We'd had a talk with him and finally gotten George to understand how seriously he needed help. He'd been persuaded to speak to a new doctor about his sleep issues, and he came back with a new prescription. He also acknowledged how obsessed he had become with the game and agreed to take a break from working on it. He was still in a bad state, but he'd taken the first steps in getting his life back together. I made a mistake then, though I didn't realize it at the time. I allowed George to keep the possessed copy of the game. As long as the wraith remained in his life, its grip on his mind would never loosen. Not understanding that truth cost George everything. A couple of days after our last exchange, George was found dead in his apartment. It was a seizure, the doctors said. The seizure caused apnea, which was what caused his sudden death. The scene must have been traumatizing for his mother, who discovered him in his apartment. When she'd found him, he was lying on the floor. The room was dark except for the flickering light of his computer. It was locked on the game world. George was spread-eagled. His face turned to the side and one of his arms was dislocated. It felt like so little time ago that I was hanging out at George's place with a pile of pizzas and some drinks, and we were laughing at some silly game he'd created over the weekend for a game jam. The George the First remembered was a totally different person from the haggard and mottled skeleton of a person we saw at the funeral. The game was abandoned. After a couple months passed, we began working on a new project together, but without George there to guide and motivate us, it lacked the passion and drive it needed to get anywhere. Soon enough, we abandoned it too. As for the wraith, it sat untouched within an unidentified file on George's computer for a while. His home remained undisturbed for close to a year. George's mother eventually decided to clean up the apartment. She asked us if there was anything of his we wanted to keep. After some deliberation, I agreed to be the one to go back there to retrieve his computer containing the possessed copy of the game. My friends and I replayed the game to make sure the wraith hadn't moved again. Once we agreed that it was still inhabiting the game, we deliberated on what to do with it. We decided we couldn't dispose of the computer. The wraith would transfer itself to another conduit, and with the new item, it would prey on someone else, perhaps another one of us. After some debate, we agreed to have it sealed away instead. We hoped it might remain inactive if it was isolated from people, as it had been before I moved into the house. Nick rented out a storage unit. We locked the hard drive of the computer in a safe box, and we left it there. We hoped to never have to lay eyes on it again. For a couple of years, our plan actually worked. Nothing could replace the piece of our lives the wraith had stolen, but at least now we knew it wouldn't hurt anyone else. Things were complicated when the storage space was robbed. Nothing was stolen from the unit we'd rented, but the one next door was completely trashed. Nick elected to move the safe box and its contents to a new, more secure location. Just in case, he said. Somewhere along the journey moving it, I believe the wraith abandoned the hard drive and attached itself to something in Nick's car. From there, it followed him home and silently slipped into his life. We didn't figure out this had happened until much later. Since graduating college, Nick had become a successful voice actor. He found roles in some video games and a couple of minor TV shows. Nick was also an aspiring ventriloquist, something he picked up from his father. His father had been a semi-popular ventriloquist during his time, and Nick liked to talk about continuing his legacy. It should be noted Nick had never been great at ventriloquism. He was convinced he was good at it, but he really wasn't. He loved doing acts on stage, but very few could sit through the performances and feel entertained the way he entertained himself. He had a very off-brand kind of humor that only he seemed to understand, and he didn't take criticism of his acts very well. The fact was, Nick was a great voice actor, and he had the technique down perfectly for making the dummy appear as if it were talking. But he just couldn't put together an interesting script, and that ruined his performances. Everything changed when the wraith returned in its newest form a couple months later. Nick introduced his audiences to Tommy, the ventriloquist dummy he claimed to have discovered stashed away inside the depths of his basement. Nick played the role of a submissive character to the dummy, who subjected him to sharing with the audience embarrassing and controversial stories of their years spent together. It was a new kind of act, and quite different from the material he relied on previously, and it worked out great. The new content was engaging and funny, and it stood him out from his competitors. In a couple of weeks, he had gone from being a local bar performer to a local sensation. I knew the first time I saw him perform with Tommy in person that something was wrong with the dummy. I wasn't the only one who felt that way either. My friends shared my suspicions. My fear was all but confirmed after we visited Nick in person after one show. When I looked into the dummy's dead, white eyes, I sensed something staring back at me. I felt the same way I did when I played our unfinished game, and the way I felt being around the possessed portraits. Nick patiently explained that we were silly to be worried about him. The dummy wasn't possessed or haunted, he said with a chuckle. He'd convinced himself everything that happened with George was a result of a mental health crisis, and the wraith never really existed in the first place. The more we pushed him, the more irritable he became. He laughed at us. He called us crazy and claimed we were jealous of his success. He told us we were all pathetic and then threatened to stop speaking to us if we didn't drop the issue. We were still arguing with one another about how to get him to see sense when an unexpected opportunity presented itself. A few weeks later, Nick asked me to review a new act he was working on. I was the only one on good terms with him at the time, but I managed to convince Nick to allow his friends to come over so they could apologize to him in person for the previous fight. The three of us had agreed to try something more radical. When we came over to visit, Matthew and Hayden, once they'd both convinced Nick of their remorse, we asked to see his newest act, and he settled in to show it to us. The moment he got the dummy out, we sprung into action. His reaction was comical. He refused to give up on his act as we tried to snatch Tommy out of his hands. The dummy begged him for help as we tried to wrestle it away from him. It started laughing as he chased us through the house, its jaw swinging up and down as Nick ran after us. Nick was making the hysterical laughing sound, and yet simultaneously wore a completely horrified expression on his face. Once we'd made our escape, we smashed it into pieces with a hammer and threw the remains into the trash. The very next day, Nick was back on stage with the same dummy, which didn't have a scratch on it, acting like nothing had happened. He refused to speak to any of us again after that. We returned to researching the origins of the entity, hoping to find a way to get rid of the source of our problems. I won't get into this much because it was a futile exercise. When we asked for help online, the responses we got ranged from disbelieving to making fun of us. We talked to two people who claimed they could help us, but they both turned out to be trolls. That was about the extent of it. The Wraith was manipulating Nick, I suspected. It gave him a taste of fame and success like he'd never experienced before and got him drunk on it. He quickly became dependent on the dummy, since he couldn't perform without it. Over time, Nick's performances became increasingly disturbing and provocative. I continued to see them sporadically after our fallout, still convinced I could somehow get through to him. They were difficult to sit through. He knew certain things about the audience, who he frequently interacted with. The interactions he shared with people left many uncomfortable or offended. Others were entertained by his uncanny abilities and provocative personality. I saw people who were in hysterics after watching his performances, and talked to others who were religious, fanatic fans of his. As its grip over his mind tightened, Nick began to talk to the dummy outside of shows. This was first spotted by his family, but it became obvious to everyone else around him in time. He had begun taking it with him wherever he went. Near the end, his brother claimed he never saw Nick without Tommy latched onto him. It had become his permanent companion, a part of him. This behavior didn't do wonders for his reputation, but by then he had accumulated a loyal band of followers who didn't care how eccentric and messed up he acted. The Wraith gave him the success he'd dreamed of since he was a child, but it did so at an unspeakable price. As for what happened to Nick, we never figured out a way to help him. The last place he was ever seen was somewhere strange called the Grand Circus of Mysteries. He worked there for a while as one of the star performers before inexplicably disappearing off the face of the earth following a particularly disturbed act. The dummy left with him, but I had no doubt the thing living inside it was still lurking out there somewhere. I lost track of the entity for a while after it had finished with Nick. I assumed it had gone on to haunt somebody else's life. Personally, I wanted nothing more to do with it. My remaining moved out of town, and I soon lost contact with them. I think we all felt responsible for failing Nick, and we saw each other as reminders of this failure. It was better for all of us if we put the past behind us and moved on with our separate lives. I was watching the news one day some years later. The anchor began discussing a sinkhole which had appeared in a stretch of desolate plains outside of my hometown. They described it as a black hole in the ground which sucked in all the light from around it. I visited the place in person a couple days later. By then half the people in town had gone over to take a look. I approached close enough to lean over and look down into the depths of the cave. When I gazed into the abyss, I felt something deep within staring back up at me. There I fell into a kind of daze. I felt as if I were falling into the blackness. The world around me became unreal and distant. My wife, who'd gone out there with me, claimed I stood over the hole for over a minute, swaying slightly as I stared down into it. It was her who broke me out of my trance. She had to slap me several times before I returned to my senses. By then, I was leaning over far enough that she swore I was about to fall in. I've been keeping track of the sinkhole since I visited it. I heard a group of kids dared someone to venture inside shortly after I went there. Jeff, I believe his name was. He reappeared a couple of days later with no recollection of having gone missing. I saw an older version of this boy in the news the other day, nearly 10 years later. After I heard about what he did, I figured it was time for me to finally get this story out there. I'm guessing the wraith has moved on from him by now. Perhaps it returned to the sinkhole, or maybe it has attached itself to a new conduit. Wherever it is, I don't doubt it is searching for another victim. Stay safe out there. Elisa's life was quiet, predictable. Mornings filled with ballet practice, the wooden floor cool against her bare feet, the scent of rosin thick in the air. Afternoons spent teaching at the studio, the sound of point shoes tapping like whispers against the mirrored walls. Evenings curled up with a book, the weight of silence pressing against her like a familiar embrace. She thrived in movement, every pirouette, every extension a reminder of her discipline. Alone in her small apartment, she found solace in routine, in the silence of an existence shaped by her own choices. Then the letters started. The first one arrived on a Wednesday, slipped under her door. The paper was soft, worn, as if handled too many times. It smelled faintly of old ink and something sweet, almost like lavender. The ink bled slightly at the edges, spiderwebbing into the fibers of the page. But the handwriting, it was hers. My dearest Elise, I miss you. Please don't shut me out. Love, anyone. Elise frowned. A prank? A stalker? The next day another letter arrived, desperate, apologetic. By Friday, they came daily, feverish declarations of love and regret. The words seemed to tremble on the page, the strokes of ink uneven, frantic. She stopped sleeping. Shadows clung to the corners of her vision, stretching long fingers across her walls. She double-checked her locks, the cold metal biting against her fingertips. She burned the letters, the acrid scent of smoke curling into her lungs. Yet every morning, a new one lay waiting, untouched by flame or time. Then the horror struck her. The ink-stained tips of her fingers, the faint scent of paper and iron clinging to her skin. The exhaustion pooling behind her eyes, thick as molasses. She set up her phone to record the night. In the morning, she forced herself to press play. There, in the dim light, she watched as she rose from bed. Silent, barefoot. Her breath came in slow, shallow waves. Sitting at her desk, she wrote, her fingers gliding across the paper in frantic strokes. Her lips moved, whispering words she couldn't hear. The pen trembled in her grasp as if fighting her, yet she kept writing, her movements filled with a longing that didn't belong to her. The final letter brought the truth. Elise, please remember. You promised we'd always be together. Memories didn't return all at once. They came in fragments, slipping through the cracks of her mind like ink bleeding through paper. A hospital room. The sterile scent of antiseptic. Cold steel pressing against her spine. White sheets, rough against her skin. Fingers intertwined, a whispered promise. Together, always. The two of them, tucked into the same bed, Elsie humming as she traced words into Elise's palm. A secret language. Our secret. Elsie always wrote. Poems in the margins of books. Notes pressed under Elise's pillow. The scratch of her pen in the dead of night. She never minded that Elise was the one who shined. I'll always be with you, she had said, smiling, her voice warm and certain. But the dreams of dance grew heavier. The hushed conversations between doctors. The decision made in silence. The operation. The knowledge that only one of them could leave that table breathing. And Elise had chosen herself. She had screamed. She had grieved. The air had felt too thick, the world too sharp without Elsie's warmth. But she had survived. She had forced herself to forget. A movement in the mirror caught her eye. She turned, heart hammering. Her reflection remained still, watching her. The eyes were hers, but behind them, something else lurked, waiting. A voice whispered in her ear, soft as turning pages. You should have let me live. Her fingers twitched, ink pooling beneath her nails. The scent of paper filled her lungs, dry and suffocating. Against her will, her hands lifted. The pen, still wet with black, hovered over a fresh sheet of paper. She gasped, trying to pull away, but her body no longer belonged to her. The ink bled into the page. My dearest Elise, I never left. I never will. Love, Elsie. Have you ever worked a job where something just felt off? Not just the usual workplace weirdness, annoying customers, bad management, or soul-crushing hours, but something deeper, like an unspoken presence, something lurking just beneath the surface. You can't explain it, but you feel it. That's how I felt when I started my new job as a night clerk at a 24-hour supermarket. At first, I thought the worst part would be loneliness. The long, empty aisles stretching into silence. Maybe the boredom, the way the hours would crawl by like something trapped, suffocating under fluorescent lights. Or, at worst, dealing with the occasional drunk customer looking for beer past midnight. I was wrong. There were rules. Not regular store policies like stock the shelves or keep the floors clean. These rules were strange, unsettling. They didn't make sense. But one thing was clear, breaking them was not an option. I got hired faster than I expected. No background check. No real questions. Just a brief meeting with the manager, an old guy named Gary, who looked like he had seen far too many night shifts. He sat behind the counter, his fingers tapping against the cheap laminate surface in a slow, steady rhythm. "The night shift is simple," he said, his voice low and tired. "Not many people come in. You stock the shelves. Watch the security monitors. That's it." Seemed easy enough. Until he reached under the counter, pulled out a folded piece of paper, and slid it toward me. "Follow these rules," he said, his tone sharper now. "Don't question them. Just do exactly what they say." I picked up the paper, expecting it to be a list of store policies, emergency procedures, closing duties, stuff like that. But as soon as my eyes landed on the first rule, something in my stomach twisted. Rules for the night clerk. 1. If you see a man in a long coat standing in aisle 3, do not approach him. Do not acknowledge him. He will leave at exactly 2:16 a.m. 2. If the phone rings more than once between 1 a.m. and 1:15 a.m., do not answer it. Let it ring. 3. If a woman with wet hair enters the store and asks to use the restroom, tell her it is out of order. No matter what she says, do not let her go inside. 4. Check the bread aisle at 3 a.m. If a loaf of bread is missing, immediately lock the front doors and hide in the break room until 3:17 a.m. Do not look at the cameras during this time. 5. If you hear the sound of children laughing after 4 a.m., do not leave the register. Do not speak. Do not move until the laughter stops. I let out a short, nervous laugh before I could stop myself. "This a joke?" I asked, glancing up at Gary. He didn't smile. Didn't even blink. His face remained unreadable, his eyes dark and sunken. "Not a joke, kid." His voice was flat. "Just follow the rules, and you'll be fine." And with that, he turned and walked toward the back office, leaving me standing there, keys in hand, paper in my grip, my pulse thrumming like a warning bell. The first hour passed without incident. A couple of late-night customers drifted in, grabbed snacks, paid, and left without much conversation. The store was eerily quiet. The kind of quiet that made you hyper-aware of every flicker of the lights, every distant hum of the refrigerators in the back. I restocked the cereal aisle, wiped down the counters, kept an eye on the security monitors, expecting to feel ridiculous for worrying about a silly list of rules. Then, at exactly 1:07 a.m., the phone rang. A sharp, mechanical chime cut through the silence. I froze. The rule flashed in my head. If the phone rings more than once between 1 a.m. and 1:15 a.m., do not answer it. Let it ring. But it was just the first ring. Maybe it was nothing. A wrong number. A prank. I reached for the receiver. My fingers brushed against the plastic. The line went dead. The ringing stopped. I exhaled, shaking my head. Maybe this was all just some weird initiation prank for new employees. Maybe Gary got a kick out of freaking people out. Then the phone rang again. 2 rings now. I stared at it. My hand hovered over the receiver. A cold feeling crept down my spine. What's the worst that could happen if I answered? Then, on the security monitor, something shifted. My breath caught in my throat. A man was standing outside the store, just barely out of view of the cameras. He wasn't moving. He wasn't pacing or looking at his phone like a normal person. He was just standing there. The phone rang a third time. I backed away from the counter. My instincts screamed at me not to pick it up, and I didn't. I let it ring. The 4th ring. Then silence. I exhaled, tension still coiled tight in my chest. Slowly, I turned my eyes back to the monitors. The man outside was gone. For the next hour, nothing happened. The store remained quiet, the aisles undisturbed. The only sounds were the low hum of the refrigerators and the occasional creak of the old ceiling vents. I kept glancing at the phone, half expecting it to ring again, but it didn't. I told myself it was just a coincidence. Some late-night weirdo lurking outside, a misdialed number, nothing more. But I wasn't in the mood to take chances. The uneasy feeling from earlier refused to fade. Instead, it grew, settling deep in my gut like a warning. I didn't understand what was happening, But one thing was clear now. I had to take the rules seriously. So when the clock hit 2:15 a.m., I turned toward aisle 3. And he was there, a tall man in a long coat, standing perfectly still, facing the shelves. A shiver crawled up my spine. My grip tightened around the edge of the counter. Do not approach him. Do not acknowledge him. He will leave at exactly 2:16 a.m. My gaze darted to the security monitor. 2 hours, 15 minutes, and 34 seconds. The numbers glowed ominously, steady and unblinking. I held my breath. Seconds dragged by, each one stretching longer than the last. My heartbeat pounded against my ribs. The man didn't move, didn't shift, didn't even seem to breathe. He stood there, staring at the shelves as if he was waiting for something, or someone. The lights gave a brief, uneasy flicker, and in that split second, my eyes caught the security monitor, 2:16 a.m. The aisle was empty. Just gone, like he had never been there at all. No footsteps, no flicker of movement. One moment, he was there, the next, he wasn't. I sucked in a shaky breath, my hands clammy against the counter. Had I imagined it? Was this some elaborate prank? Or had I stepped into something I wasn't meant to see? A chill settled over me, a creeping, suffocating weight in my chest. I felt like I had mistakenly stepped into another world, one where the normal rules of reality didn't apply. I didn't want to check the bread aisle. Every instinct screamed at me to stay put, to pretend none of this was real. But I had already ignored the phone rule, and I wasn't about to make the mistake of doubting another. The rules existed for a reason. Swallowing the lump in my throat, I forced my legs to move. Step by step, I made my way toward the bread aisle, my breath shallow and uneven. Then I noticed one loaf was missing. The air left my lungs. I didn't think, didn't hesitate. I spun on my heel and ran. My feet barely touched the ground as I sprinted to the front, heart hammering in my ears. I slammed the locks on the front doors, then bolted for the break room. My hands shook as I flicked off the lights and collapsed into the corner, curling into myself. The store was silent. Too silent. The kind of silence that makes your skin prickle, that makes you feel like something is waiting just beyond the edge of your vision. Then, at exactly 3:05 a.m., the security monitor in the break room flickered on. I did not touch it. The screen buzzed with static for a moment, then cleared, showing the bread aisle. Someone was standing there. No, something. It was too tall, its limbs stretched too long, its head tilted at a sickening, unnatural angle. It wasn't moving, but I knew it was looking at me. Then slowly, it turned toward the camera. My stomach lurched. My fingers dug into my arms. And then, the screen went black. I squeezed my eyes shut, my pulse roaring in my ears. The rules said hide until 3:17 a.m. I counted the seconds, one by one. Don't look. Don't move. Don't breathe too loud. The air in the room felt thick, pressing against my skin like unseen hands. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to run, but there was nowhere to go. So I waited, and waited, until finally, I opened my eyes. The security monitor was normal again. I hesitated, then forced myself to stand. My legs felt like lead as I made my way back to the front. I unlocked the doors. Then I walked to the bread aisle. The missing loaf of bread was back. I was shaking. Not just the kind of shake you get when you're cold or nervous. This was different. My whole body felt weak, my fingers numb as they clutched the counter. My breaths came in short, uneven gasps. I didn't care about my paycheck anymore. I didn't care about finishing my shift. I just wanted to leave. Then, at exactly 4:02 a.m., I heard it. A sound that made my blood turn to ice. A soft, distant laugh echoed, barely there, yet impossible to ignore. At first, I thought I imagined it, the way exhaustion plays tricks on your mind. But then it came again, high-pitched, playful, like children playing hide-and-seek. It echoed through the aisles, weaving between the shelves, moving closer. My grip on the counter tightened until my knuckles turned white. Do not leave the register. Do not speak. Do not move until the laughter stops. The rule repeated in my head like a desperate prayer. The laughter grew louder, closer. Something flickered in the corner of my vision, a shadow darting between the aisles. Fast, too fast. I sucked in a breath. I did not turn my head. I did not look. I squeezed my eyes shut, forcing myself to stay still. The laughter was right behind me now, soft, almost playful, but dripping with something that didn't belong. Light, airy, wrong. Then, something cold brushed against my neck. A shiver shot down my spine, every nerve in my body screaming. And then silence. Nothing. No laughter. No movement. Just the low hum of the lights buzzing overhead. Slowly, so slowly, I opened my eyes. The store was empty. Like nothing had ever happened. Like nothing had been there at all. But I knew better. I felt it. Something had been right behind me. I didn't wait. I grabbed my things with shaking hands, my mind screaming at me to go, go, go. I wasn't finishing my shift. I wasn't clocking out. I was done. I made it to the front door, heart pounding, already reaching for the lock. Then, I heard a voice. Low. Calm. Too calm. You did well, it said. I froze. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I turned slowly. Gary stood there, watching me. His face looked the same, but his eyes were darker. Not just tired or sunken wrong. Something inside them shifted, like something else was looking at me from beneath his skin. I took a step back. What the hell is this place? My voice barely came out a whisper. Gary smiled. You followed the rules, he said. That means you can leave. That was all he said. No explanation. No warning. Just those simple, chilling words. I didn't ask questions. I ran. I quit the next day. I didn't go back to pick up my paycheck. I didn't answer when Gary called. I tried to forget. Tried to convince myself that maybe, just maybe, it had all been a dream. A trick of my sleep-deprived mind. But late that night, as I lay in bed, my phone rang. Once. Then twice. Then 3 times. I stared at it, my breath caught in my throat. But I never answer. I let it ring. Hello. I answered the phone. I saw this number on an ad online. You're correct. What do you need? I asked, holding back laughter. I was still in disbelief that the ads had worked. I'm not sure. Things keep moving in my house. They're never where I left them when I leave. Her voice was shaking, assumingly with fear. She gave us her address, agreed on a price of $120, and we told her to stay away from the house for the day. We set off for the house with nothing but some salt, an old crucifix, and some walkie-talkies that didn't reach very far. The house wasn't too far away, about a 20-minute drive. When we arrived, she was already gone, though she said she'd leave a key under the doormat. We messed around inside the house for a while, recorded some footage for the website, and left. It was that simple. We did this about 3 more times that day, all callers from a neighboring town. We figured that since we had more callers from there, we'd do those today, and schedule the Hillkit callers for tomorrow. By the end of the day, we had $400. It was too easy. The next day we met up at the Holly Tree. That was sort of our base of operations. Sam took the first call. It was for 66 Holly Hedge Drive, the abandoned house on Sam's road. That's weird, wrote Aiden. Yeah, I agreed. Nobody's lived there for years. Sam thought it must be a prank call, so we didn't waste our time with it and went to help someone else. It didn't take long for us to get another call asking for the same address. Hello. Hi, this is Hillkit Paranormal Society. What do you need? Silence. Hello. I asked, unsure if I had been hung up on. 66 Holly Hedge Drive. It wasn't the same person as before. I panicked and hung up. That was weird, I said, concerned. Sam responded, lot of people prank calling, I guess. Must be a friend of the first kid. Hopefully, I said. Nobody wanted to admit it, for fear of being made fun of, but I could tell everyone had the same thought. We moved on to the next house. An old woman called about her dead cat's meows still being heard in her house. I felt bad about some of our clients because it was mostly paranoid, hyper-religious people dealing with mental illness. But the ethics of it didn't matter, not with May's life on the line. We arrived and the old lady was still there, and refused to leave until we had exorcised her dead cat. She handed us the keys, and we let ourselves in. Everything seemed normal at first. We pretended to search the house for where the sound was coming from, but couldn't hear anything. I called for a debrief in Sam's car. We need to fake hearing it. I proposed. Imagine how much extra she'd pay us if we actually did something. Aiden nodded and smiled. We devised a plan to meet up in her kitchen and pretend to hear the cat's meows, lay the salt down, say a few prayers, and make it look as real as possible. We headed in, straight toward the kitchen. We walked around a little, inspecting things, making ourselves look busy. Me and Sam kept glancing at each other, waiting nervously for one to make the first move. At that moment I realized how jealous I was of Aiden. Lying must be easy without having to talk. Did you hear that? I asked suddenly. It's here. Aiden nodded. Him and Sam walked over to the counter. We laid the salt out and tried not to laugh as I said some prayers I learned at church camp when I was younger. The old lady came inside the house to check on us and saw what we were doing. She smiled and wished us luck, but as she turned to leave the house, she stopped. We all stopped. We all heard it. All of a sudden the old woman didn't seem so crazy anymore. She hurried out of the house and told us to go down to the basement to investigate, otherwise we wouldn't get paid. I looked at Aiden nervously. We exchanged looks that gave the impression that neither of us wanted to be here. As we stepped toward the exit, we heard a door open from behind us. I spun around. It was Sam. He was headed down the basement stairs. "What are you doing?" I asked, annoyed. "Curing my fucking sister." He ran down the stairs, stomping. I felt bad for whatever creature was down there. The sound grew louder as there was a loud snap. The power went out, but the sound kept going, piercing through the dark emptiness of the house. Me and Aiden hurried after Sam. Halfway down the stairs, we heard him muttering something under his breath. The meowing had stopped, and in its place, white noise began. TV static, loud and oppressive. As I reached the bottom of the stairs and turned to look at Sam, he was crying, on his knees with his pocket knife drawn in his hand. In front of him, a TV. Impossible, I thought, as the power was still off. Then I read what was on the TV. 66. We ended up getting our money, and only a few days later the old woman had moved away. We had gained quite a reputation around our area. More and more calls came in by the day. We were only a few cases off paying for her surgery. With the rise of clients came the rise of the 66 calls. We were all concerned, and though nobody said anything, I could tell. It was only a matter of time before we got too curious and visited the house. The thought made me sick to my stomach. Laying in bed that night, my phone lit up on my nightstand, the low hum breaking the dead silence of my room. I was glad to take my mind off of what happened that day, the thoughts still circling my mind, keeping me up. It was May. Bear with me, I know this sounds crazy. 2 weeks ago, I woke up in a hospital bed. They told me I was in a car accident. I don't remember the crash, just a blinding flash of light. Since being discharged, things have felt wrong. Not just slightly off, deeply off, like the world is wearing a mask, and I'm the only one who can see the seams. Little things were off at first, easy to dismiss. But today something happened. Something I can't explain. And now I know for sure. Whatever this is, it isn't just in my head. This is real. And I'm scared as fuck. At first, nothing seemed too weird. I'd never spent a night in a hospital before, so waking up in a sterile, fluorescent-lit room was bound to feel unsettling. I brushed it off. My parents were more doting than usual, but for people whose son had almost died, they took it surprisingly well. At least, until we got to the car. That's when the concern cracked, and the disappointment seeped through. They scolded me for wrecking my 2003 Saturn shitbox, calling me reckless. The words sounded right, worried, even empathetic, but something was off. My mom's face kept shifting, like she couldn't settle on how she was supposed to feel. My dad, though, he barely moved. He sat rigid, staring straight ahead, as if turning his head wasn't an option. But I could feel him watching me. His gaze lingered in the rearview mirror, heavy and cold. Each time I glanced up, I'd catch his eyes for just a split second before he snapped them back to the road. But I knew he never really looked away. After the 6th time, I stopped looking away too. The mirror became a silent one-way standoff as I waited for him to scold me through it again. He didn't so much as glance at it for the rest of the drive. It was a short drive. None of this was cause for concern, really. Nothing that followed was all that crazy. But when we got home, I felt a shift. Coming from the harsh fluorescence of the hospital and the golden stretch of road outside, I wasn't prepared for the cool dimness of the house. It wasn't dark, exactly. Mom always kept the shades open. She liked the light. But now they weren't quite shut, just not open enough. Like someone had hesitated halfway and left them there. My family didn't linger. After some pleasantries, Mom disappeared into the master bedroom. Dad went back to work, and I was left alone on the living room couch. I popped a Tylenol, took a few hits from my pen in the bathroom, and settled in. The rest of the day was mostly silent, aside from the occasional sound of Mom's bedroom door opening and closing. I wasted time scrolling on my phone, barely aware of the shifting sunlight until a beam stretched across the room and hit my eyes. I turned from my pillow to the armrest, bought myself another 20 minutes. Then another beam crept up, warming my feet like some kind of passive-aggressive warning from the sun. "All right," message received. I sighed, peeled myself off the couch, and mumbled, "Fuck it, you win," before dragging myself to my room. I was asleep before I could think too much about it. The week that followed was unusual, to say the least. It was summer break, and normally I'd be stocking shelves at Walmart or messing around with my friends, but doctor's orders were pretty straightforward. "You've got a concussion, don't be an idiot. No standing for long periods, no heavy lifting, no unnecessary risks." Fine by me. I got a doctor's note, a couple of weeks off, and a temporary escape from the joys of minimum wage labor. It wasn't the end of the world. Part-time jobs come and go. For now, I just had some headaches and a free pass to lay low. Better that than risking something worse, whether it was from dreading work or from one of my friends intentionally checking a basketball into my skull because we're over-competitive degenerates. I didn't really care to go outside much. The weather hadn't been as sunny as the first day I got back. Clouds hung low, thick and unmoving, like they were pressing down on the neighborhood. Even when the sun did break through, it was this weak, watery light that barely seemed to touch the ground. It just made staying inside feel more justified. So I did. I moved the Xbox from the basement to my room. Normally, that would have been a no-go, but if anyone asked, I'd just plead the concussion card and call it a win. No one even commented on it, which felt strange, like they should have, but didn't. I just holed up, gaming, eating, zoning out in front of Skyrim lore videos in the living room, whatever. Aside from family dinners, I didn't talk to my parents much. The conversations at the table were dull, barely conversations at all. Dad was working later than usual, often slipping away right after eating. Mom was around, I knew that much. I heard her, the bedroom doors opening and closing, the creak of the floorboards when she walked, the soft SHFF of her feet brushing across the carpet upstairs. But I barely saw her. Not in the kitchen, not in the living room, not even when I grabbed snacks at night. Come to think of it, I don't think I ever saw her downstairs. Aside from dinner. Some groceries spoiled, which was weird because Mom was normally on top of that kind of thing. When I pointed it out, she took me shopping, which was actually kind of nice. I got way more say in what we stocked the fridge with than usual. That was a win. But as we wandered the aisles, I noticed something. People were staring at me. Not in a casual, passing way, intensely. Like they were trying to memorize my face. Or maybe like they weren't sure what they were looking at. Each time I caught someone, they snapped their head away like they hadn't been watching at all. But the feeling stayed. Not a single person looked like they could hold a normal expression on their faces. It was like they shifted through raw emotions during the most mundane tasks. I began to feel in danger. And worse, I started to notice something else. As Mom and I passed people, I swore I could hear them pivot to watch me after we walked by. I never actually saw it happen, but I could hear it. The soft squeak of a shoe turning, the faint rustle of fabric shifting. I wanted to ask Mom if she noticed anything, but the words stuck in my throat. If she hadn't, I'd sound crazy. If she had, I didn't want to know. I tried to shrug it off. I'd been a complete goblin for the past week, barely keeping up with shaving. And yeah, my facial hair was patchy as hell. Maybe I just looked like a mess. Maybe I was imagining things. Whatever. When I got back home, I hopped on Xbox, made plans with some friends for later in the week, and told myself I'd get cleaned up by then. Everything was fine. Everything was fine. 2 days passed. Nothing noteworthy, just my growing awareness of how off everything felt. Mom was moving around more. At least, I think she was. I'd hear her footsteps, soft shuffling noises that always seemed to stop right outside my door. The first few times, I brushed it off. Maybe she was just passing by. Maybe she was listening for signs that I was awake. But the more I paid attention, the more it felt deliberate. The house was dim, sure, but my room wasn't. I kept my bay window shades open, letting in just enough light to make it feel normal. Or at least, less like the rest of the house. The hallway outside, though, it was always in shadow. There was only one time of day where light from the high windows in the living room even touched my door. And it wasn't now. That's why I knew I shouldn't have seen anything. And yet, I did. I heard her. That same soft shuffle. I glanced over from the edge of my bed, half expecting nothing, just another trick of my nerves. But for a split second, I saw them. Her toenails. Just at the edge of the door. The instant I registered them, they shot back, too fast. So fast it was like they hadn't been there at all. But I knew what I saw. The carpet where they had been left the faintest depression before slowly rising back into place. My stomach twisted. Okay, that was it. No more dab pen. No more convincing myself I wasn't tripping out when clearly I was seeing shit. I waited, listened, heard her shuffle away. Her door clicked shut. I exhaled, rubbed my face, and stood up. Enough of this. I needed to get out of the house. Needed to see my friends, James, Nikki D, and Tyler. The goal was simple: sober up, ground myself, and maybe, just maybe, bring up what was going on. Over Xbox, they'd all sounded completely normal. I'd only mentioned a few things in passing, nothing that set off any alarms for them. Most of our talks had just been about girls from our school, memes, and bullshitting in Rainbow Six Siege lobbies. Maybe I was just overthinking. Maybe everything was fine. But as I grabbed my keys and headed for the door, I couldn't shake the feeling that, somewhere upstairs, Mother was listening. Obviously, driving wasn't an option. My car was totaled. My parents handed me $250 for the scrap it was apparently worth. And that was that. So I dusted off my old bike from the shed in the back. I didn't even glance at the house on my way out. Didn't need to see my creepy-ass mom peeking from some upstairs window like a horror movie extra. If I did, I'd probably swerve straight into traffic just to avoid dealing with it. Instead, I shoved the thoughts down and let myself believe, for just a little longer, that I was just tripping balls. That was safer. That was better. Besides, my odds were good. I still had headaches. I was still a little stoned. I was still taking Tylenol. Put it all together, and maybe my brain was just running like a laggy Xbox. I rode up to the high school football field in about 20 minutes and hopped the fence. Everyone was already there: James, Nikki D, and Tyler. And what followed? It was awesome. The dap-ups were a little stiff at first, but once we got going, everything fell into place. We had a pump, a football, which lasted about 10 minutes before it needed air again, and a frisbee. The sun was bright for the first time since I'd left the hospital, and for the first time in days, I felt good. I'd shaved, I was surrounded by my friends, and I started to think, no, I started to hope, that maybe I'd just been missing out on real, in-person socialization. I almost fell for it. I almost let myself believe everything was fine. We played for hours. Eventually, we were wiped, ready to debrief before heading home. I was closest to the corner of the field where the old water pump was, so I went first. Yanked the lever, let the water rush out, cupped my hands, drank. The others chatted behind me, their voices blending with the soft splash of the pump. Refreshed, I wandered back to where we'd been playing frisbee, flopped onto the grass, and pulled out my phone. The sun was brutal, washing out the screen. I tilted it, angling downward to block the glare, squinting as I reached for the power button. And then I froze, because in the black reflection of my phone's screen, I saw them. All three of them, standing at the water pump, staring at the back of my head. James and Tyler's faces were wrong. Their jaws hung open, too wide, far past what should have been possible. It wasn't just slack, it was distorted. Their bottom lips curled downward, just enough to reveal rows of teeth. Their heads tilted forward, eyes locked onto me, shoulders hunched, arms dangling too loosely at their sides. They looked like something out of a nightmare. Like The Scream, but worse. Nicky wasn't as bad. He was staring too, but his face shifted, the same way my mom's did when she picked me up from the hospital. Like he couldn't quite get it right. And yet, their conversation hadn't stopped. Their voices came out perfectly, flowing like normal. But James and Tyler weren't moving their mouths. The water pump was still running. I had my phone up for maybe a second, but my whole body jerked like I'd been stabbed. My fingers fumbled, and my phone slipped from my hands, landing in the grass with a soft thud. Nicky asked if I was good. I could barely think, barely breathe. Beads of sweat formed on my temples. I swallowed hard, forced a smile, forced the words out. Yeah, I'm great. And I turned to face them. Normal. They looked normal. Everything was normal. But my stomach twisted into knots, because I knew what I saw. And for the first time since I got home, I realized I had nowhere to run. You sure you're good? I can't even remember who asked me that. Yeah, I'm good, man. My head's just pounding. I think I should go home. That part was true. It was pounding. Nicky frowned. You need a ride? Internally, fuck no. Externally, nah bro. What, you like driving dudes around in your car or something? You into teenage boys? I got this. The other two laughed. The tension cracked, just a little. We all started getting ready to part ways, but I dragged it out. Paced around their cars, made jokes, tossed the football over the hoods, anything to stall. I kept stealing glances at the mirrors and windows, waiting for another glimpse at what was under their veils. Nothing. The first few times, I swear I saw their eyes dart away from mine in the reflections, like they knew what I was doing. Then, it was like they just stopped looking towards me altogether. No matter how I angled myself, how fast I glanced, I never caught them like I had on the field. And yet, looking back, I can't shake the feeling, like they knew exactly where I was looking. Like they had just found ways to stare at me from difficult angles without me ever catching their eyes. I'm just glad they let me go home. I don't know what the end goal is, but I feel like I'm being bled out, played with before I'm eaten. Eaten. I managed to steady my breathing on the ride back. As I pulled up to my house, I veered toward the spare garage, an old, detached structure barely used except for storage. I figured I'd leave my bike in there for now, just so I wouldn't have to linger outside any longer than necessary. I wheeled up to the side door, gripping the rusted handle. The lock had long since broken, and with a firm push, the door groaned open. Dust and stale air hit me first, the scent of old cardboard and forgotten junk. The space was dim, faintly illuminated by streetlights filtering through the grimy windows. I rolled my bike inside, careful not to trip over scattered tools and warped furniture, when I froze. In the center of the garage, right where it shouldn't be, was my car. Perfectly intact. Not totaled. Not even scratched. My breath caught in my throat. I took a slow step forward, fingers brushing the hood. Cold. Real. Tangible. The last I'd heard of this car, I was being told it had been wrecked. Scrapped. My parents handed me $250 and said that's all it was worth. So why was it here? I circled to the driver's side and peered inside. The keys weren't in the ignition, but they dangled from the dash. Something was off. The seat, normally adjusted to fit me, was pushed all the way back, like someone much taller had been sitting there. A low tremor crawled up my spine. The car, despite being untouched, was covered in dust. How long was I in the hospital? Doesn't matter. It was getting dark. I did a quick fluid check, ran my hands over the tires, making sure it'd be ready if I needed it, then jogged back to the house. But the second I stepped through the front door, it hit me again. Rapid, aggressive shuffling, door slam, then in a voice too casual, too normal to be real. Honey, you missed dinner. Want me to heat some up for you? Nope. It's okay, Mom. I'll handle it. The living room TV was blue-screened, casting a sickly glow over the open floor plan. I didn't dare mess with my parents' setup. At this point, they had to know I was onto them, and I would do nothing to disturb the peace. I grabbed some snacks from the fridge, went straight to my room, locked the door, dug out my old iPod Gen 6 from middle school, buried in a shoebox, and set it to charge. For a while, I just sat there listening. It was too quiet. I FaceTimed the iPod from my phone, hesitating, debating whether I should even leave my room. The upstairs layout was simple. For rooms, mine was first on the left at the top of the stairs. My parents' was last on the right. At the very end, a closet, where we kept detergent and towels. My bathroom was the last door on the left. The plan was simple, a strategic iPod drop-off during my next bathroom run. I executed flawlessly, waiting for the next round of patrolling before slipping out. I cracked the closet door just enough to give my iPod a view down the hall, plugged the charger in beneath the bottom shelf, and left it there. A hidden eye. A way to see what my parents really looked like when they thought no one was watching. I almost regret this decision. It seemed fine when I got back into my room and locked the door. I quietly angled my dresser in front of it, wedging my desk chair as tightly as I could under the handle. Too much movement. I heard my parents' door fly open, slamming into the inside wall of their bedroom. By the time I grabbed my phone, she was already there, standing at the end of the hall, facing my door, swaying. She was past the weird shifting face that Nikki had. Whatever this is, there's stages. Her jaw wasn't just distended, it was stretched beyond its limit. The skin pulled so tight it dangled with every sway of her body. Even from here, I could see the bags under her eyes. Not just dark circles, but loose, sagging folds that drooped to her upper lip, exposing way too much dry, pink eyelid. Her hair, thin and patchy, clung to her scalp with a greasy sheen from the glow of the living room TV and the dim light spilling from the master bedroom. Her arms didn't hang. Her elbows were bent at stiff, unnatural 90-degree angles, shoulders hunched forward, wrists limp, long bony fingers dangling. The only way I knew it was my mom was the pajama top. It clung to her sharp, skeletal frame, stretched over the ridges of her spine, hanging loose around her frail shoulders. She leaned in, pressed against the door, her head tilted, slow, deliberate, like she could see through the wood, tracking exactly where I was. and then a whisper. "Honey, are you awake?" Her mouth didn't move. Lips stretched thin, jaw unhinged and frozen in that grotesque, slack-jawed state. But the words came anyway, perfectly clear, perfectly human. "I know you're up, honey. I just heard you moving." "Ah, yeah. I just moved some furniture around. I didn't like where my TV was." A pause. Then the whisper again. Perfectly clear. Perfectly human. "Can I see?" My throat tightened. "Tomorrow," I lied. "I'm naked right now. I don't want to get dressed. Please. Please. Please work." I was frozen, my face glued to my phone screen, not daring to look away from the grainy FaceTime feed. My breath barely made a sound. Then finally, "Okay. Tomorrow then." As she spoke, something shifted in the farthest, darkest corner past the stairs. At first, I thought it was just shadow, but then an arm. Thin, brittle, dangling down from the ceiling like a puppet on cut strings. Another arm followed, then a body, slow and deliberate, lowering itself down the wall. My stomach turned to ice. Dad. Did he ever even leave the house? Was he already this far along when he picked me up from the hospital with Mom? None of it mattered. He moved with absolute silence, clambering up the stairs as Mom whispered one last time, "Good night, son. I love you." Then Dad shuffled past her. Same stiff, unnatural cadence Mom had been moving with for weeks. If I weren't staring straight at him, I would have sworn it was still her. He went to the master bedroom, closed the door. Then, without making a single noise, he came back. A trick I would have surely fell for if I hadn't been watching them this whole time. He ended right behind where she was standing. And that brings me to now. For the past 2 hours, they've been outside my door. Every move I make, they track it. Through the wood. Through the silence. It's 3:02 a.m. If I can just make it to daylight without passing out, I think I can open the bay window and jump. After that, straight to the spare garage, grab the car, get the fuck out of town. I don't know how far this shit has spread, but I can't stay here. Oh fuck. They're getting on the ground. Lowering themselves. Peeking under the door. I might have to go right now. Okay. Fuck. I'll update this when I'm safe. The tuxedo fit like a dream. Hiram felt very James Bond. There was a burning desire for a martini glass to complete the ensemble. He surveyed his surroundings. It was a lush ballroom. Grand arched windows showered the room with light. Gorgeous stone walls, an engraved ceiling with crystal chandeliers. A wraparound mezzanine provided a second level, with a grand central staircase. Hiram felt as if the staircase had always been here. Something primordial. The rest of the building raised around it to support its grandiosity. The marble stairs gleamed. Tasteful tile fringed the edges of the room. Elegant dining tables atop burgundy carpets. There was even a parquet dance floor. He wasn't sure who in his life could afford this type of opulence, but he was happy to be among these fine folks. Hiram scanned the room for a bar, but bodies shielded him at every turn. The crowd seemed to be growing, but he couldn't tell how. He saw waitstaff walking around with champagne flutes, but the tray always seemed to empty right before he could grab one. He didn't recognize a soul. He tried to join in conversations, but no one was receptive. He didn't seem to exist to the other attendees. The room began to suffocate him. He needed to get outside. The more he tried to push through the throngs of people, the more seemed to appear. They ushered him towards the bottom of the staircase. He abandoned his dreams of fresh air and simply let the crush direct him. Somewhere, someone cleared their throat. All conversation concluded. Everyone turned and stared at him. No, not him. The staircase. He turned with them, hoping to fit in. Massive curtains were drawn over the windows. Utter darkness. A chill ran up his spine. He didn't think he'd ever escape this place. He closed his eyes. A clap snapped him back to reality. A spotlight illuminated the top of the stairs. A grand organ began to play, "Here Comes the Bride." He felt comforted by these familiar notes. Maybe the day would proceed from here as normal. But the song did not continue. The organist began to play one note over and over like a metronome. Hiram felt the crowd around him begin to stomp in unison. He was frozen, unable to join in. 2 figures appeared in the spotlight. The bride was all white lace, veiled and shrouded with a massive train in her wake. The groom clad in all black, sleek and broad-shouldered. Each step they descended coincided with a haunting organ note and a stomp from their audience. An unholy buzz began to fill the room. Hiram did not belong here. He knew no one. He was frightened by these people. The bouquet in the bride's hand began to droop and die and rot. No one noticed or cared. A small drop of crimson appeared at her midsection. It bloomed as she drew closer. She showed no signs of injury or impairment. Hiram called for help, but it fell on deaf ears. The dress was mostly crimson at this point. A second clap. A spotlight was now on Hiram as well. His tuxedo was gone. He was in the black and white trappings of a priest. Was he to marry this couple? He feared he didn't know the words. Dearly beloved, we have gathered here today. No one in this room felt beloved. They felt damned dangerous. The somber couple reached the bottom step. Silence fell. The bride's veil began to raise on its own accord. The features that greeted Hiram were both beautiful and terrifying. Too sharp, too enticing. They stirred something in his loins he'd rather not think about. He was a man of the cloth, fighting the urge to ravage the bride he was here to wed. But there was something else about the bride's features. They were familiar. When he looked into her deep brown eyes, he knew. The groom caught his recognition, and his mouth twisted into a Cheshire grin. We couldn't conceive of anyone more fitting for this occasion, drawled the groom. The voice was too rich. Hiram felt like he was choking on molasses just hearing it. Every eye in the room was on Hiram. He opened the Bible in his hands to the bookmarked page. Had he always been holding it? Blank. He flipped a page. Blank. He furiously flipped, but nothing was there. The groom cackled at him. The room began to cackle with him. The bride's eyes dug into him. Hiram was alone in a den of hyenas, waiting to be devoured. He finally found a page with writing. He prepared to address the horde until he saw the words. Abandon all hope, ye who enter here. He opened his mouth to scream, but nothing came out. He closed his eyes once more, and the cackling ceased. When he opened them again, the ballroom was empty. Relief washed over him, at least until the first chandelier fell. Then another. Deafening boom after deafening boom. He thought of how angry his mother became at unexpected loud noises. What he'd give to see her one last time. He never thanked her enough, never hugged her enough. When was the last time he'd said he loved her? A cord snaps. Hiram looked up just in time to accept his fate. Growing up, I had a very normal life. However, this all changed when I moved houses in the 7th grade. After that, everything went downhill. At first, everything was seemingly normal. Sure, I was nervous about leaving my old friends behind, but I figured it wouldn't be hard to make new ones as I was a very social kid. The house itself was beautiful. Sure, it was old, but nothing out of the ordinary. My parents were excited, as was I, until we stepped inside the house. I remember feeling a chill on the back of my neck. I looked up and noticed there was a vent beside me. I laughed it off, figuring it was just the air conditioner as it was summertime. I remember walking down the narrow hallway. To the right was a bathroom, and to the left the laundry room. At the end of the hallway was my new bedroom. Once I opened the door, something felt off. It was as if the air had dropped at least 15 degrees. What struck me most, however, was the vent. It was placed high up, almost too high up as it was out of place. There wasn't anything out of ordinary about it, but something just didn't feel right. I brushed it off and started unpacking. Once I was somewhat done, it was already almost midnight. I figured I should probably get some sleep as I wanted to explore the town in the morning. I fell asleep with little to no trouble. Suddenly, I woke up and checked the timer. It was 3:30 a.m. on the dot. I sighed and tried to roll over. I couldn't move. Suddenly, I heard a noise. I looked up at where the noise was. It was coming from the vents. Suddenly, I noticed a red glow coming from inside of it. My breathing quickened as I tried to move. A few minutes later, I was finally able to move and the glow disappeared. I jumped out of bed and turned the dot lights on. I figured it must have been an animal, and I would have my father check it out in the morning. The night went by slowly. I watched the sun rise and heard my parents get out of bed. I left my room and met my mother making breakfast. I told her about what I had saw, and she assured me it was likely a small animal, or my imagination. I laughed it off and walked around town for a bit. I met some kids who were also living in my neighborhood. When I told them where I lived, I remember the shocked look on their faces. They told me that the last family there had been brutally murdered and nobody could find out who did it. They said that their bodies looked like they had been mauled by a wild animal. I figured they were just messing with me, so I left the subject alone. The looks on their faces, however, made me feel like there was some sort of truth to it. Once the sun went down, I walked home. I saw a note on the kitchen counter that was signed by my parents. The note said they went out to dinner. This wasn't out of the usual, so I shrugged it off. I took my shoes off and went to my room. I climbed into bed and tried to relax, but the silence around me felt oppressive, like the walls themselves were closing in. My eyes kept flicking up to the vent in the corner of my room. It seemed so ordinary, but I couldn't ignore the way it made my skin crawl. The red glow from the previous night was still vivid in my memory. My heart thudded in my chest as I lay in the dark, listening. The house creaked and groaned as if it had a life of its own. I kept waiting for the sound I dreaded, the sound from the vents. It came, a soft scratching noise, the kind that almost made you think you were imagining it, but not quite. My body went rigid as I turned toward the vent. The scratching was slow at first, almost methodical, and then a faint tapping followed. Tap, tap, tap. The noise seemed to move across the ceiling, and then down the wall toward me. I felt my heartbeat in my throat as I stared at the vent. I didn't want to move, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. A cold wind brushed across my face, though I couldn't understand where it came from. The temperature in the room dropped, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. The scraping noise grew louder, then stopped. My breath caught as I heard something else, a whisper. It was so faint that I almost missed it. Come closer. My blood ran cold. It was a voice, but it wasn't my own. And it wasn't from the house. I could feel it in my bones, deep in my gut. It came from the vent, from inside the walls. I tried to move, to scream, but my body wouldn't obey. The whisper continued, now louder, clearer. We're waiting. I finally snapped back into reality, my limbs no longer frozen. I jumped out of bed, scrambling to grab the nearest thing. A baseball bat I'd left by the door for protection, though I had no idea why I thought it would help. The whispering stopped, but the feeling of being watched intensified. My skin crawled with the sensation of something creeping just out of sight, something not human. I ran to my parents' room, but it was empty. The bed was made, the room as still as the rest of the house. Their absence sent a chill through me. I just hoped they would be back soon. The scratching resumed, louder now, as if something or someone was crawling through the ducts above me. I bolted downstairs, the house feeling colder with each step. The walls felt like they were closing in, the air growing heavier. I reached the kitchen, but there was no sign of them. I checked the back door to make sure they hadn't left in a hurry, but it was locked from the inside. Then I heard it. A loud bang. It was like something heavy slamming against the walls. It came from upstairs. I froze. Something was in the house with me. I ran back up to my room, my heart pounding so loud I could barely hear over the frantic rush of my footsteps. The vent was vibrating now, as if something was pressing against it from the other side. I stood frozen in the doorway, watching in horror as the metal slats of the vent began to creak open. The growl came next. It was low, almost animal-like. And then the voice. It spoke again, louder this time, unmistakable. Come here. I felt a wave of terror rush over me. This wasn't just a prank or my imagination. There was something living in the vents, something that had been here long before I arrived, something old, dark, and hungry. In a panic, I ran from the room, tearing down the stairs, but the house seemed to shift around me. The hallway stretched longer and longer, as if the walls were moving with each step. I slammed into the front door, but it wouldn't budge. My hands shook as I fumbled for the keys. The scratching intensified behind me. Whatever was in those walls was close, too close. I could hear the growls now, almost like breathing, heavy and strained. I turned to see the hallway. There was nothing there. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. My only instinct was to escape. With a burst of adrenaline, I finally threw open the door and ran out into the night. The chill air hit me like a slap in the face, but it did little to ease the terror that gripped me. The street was empty, silent. The house loomed behind me, its windows dark and vacant. Suddenly, I woke up in a white room. My parents were standing above me with worried looks. Mom, Dad, what happened? I asked. Sweetie, you. My mother responded, almost hesitant. We found you clawing at your skin in the middle of the woods. We think it's best if you stay here for a little while. I stayed at the hospital for weeks. The doctors said I was delusional. Psychotic even. I knew what really happened. I wasn't shocked when they came in and told me my parents had been murdered. I tried to warn them, but they wouldn't listen. If they would have listened, they still would have been alive today. I'm typing this out as I just got released. I don't have much time now. I think the thing that lived in the vents followed me. I think it's mad that I escaped. I hear it above me getting closer. It wants revenge. On the preceding crossroad, turn left. My GPS guide monotonously relayed to me as I hazardously drove my Honda Civic down the narrow and pitch-black roads of Swan Vale, a vast woodland town located up in the mountains of northeastern Pennsylvania. As my engine puttered and my tires squeaked, I tried my best to scan the road ahead of me to spot the crossroad in advance, to which I barely could thanks to the branches that stretched high above the road and shielded the tarmac from moonlight. My saving grace was my crappy headlights that barely illuminated the forthcoming track. I did as my GPS requested, and once I completed the turn, I could hear a headache revving up in my head as I was greeted with yet another long, tight roadway with seemingly no end. I grit my teeth and let out hiss of pent-up frustration, tightening my grip on the steering wheel as I begrudgingly awaited the GPS to inform me of which turn to make next. I hated these roads with a burning passion, yet I sadly had to put up with them if I wanted to continue visiting my daughter. She and her husband moved to Swan Vale a year ago to start a family, and ever since then I've been visiting at least once a week. It isn't an easy task. It's about a 5-hour drive to get there and back from where I live, and I'm an old man. Yet despite that, I always make it a point to visit, regardless of how long it takes. 2 months ago, my daughter gave birth to a young healthy girl, and so I'd been visiting more frequently. And thus, I had to encounter Swan Vale's road network more frequently. The roads that lead in and out of Swan Vale may have well been designed by the devil himself. That may sound melodramatic, but I wholeheartedly believe whoever designed the road network designed it with the pure intent of inflicting psychological torment on those who drive it. The roads are fine during the day when the sun hangs in the sky, but when night falls and I'm attempting to leave town, that's when the roads become my personal hell. Up is down, right is up, down is left. My mind is swept up in the jumble that is the intertwining and identical roads of Swan Vale's road network, until eventually it's morning, and only then do I find my way out. So much to the encouragement of my daughter, I ordered myself a GPS. I left the responsibility of leading me out of town to it, and for the first 2 weeks, they were like a gift from God. No more did I spend entire nights circling the outer woods of Swan Vale with no sense of direction. Instead, I was now managing to leave the town in a matter of minutes with the help of the GPS's mapping function and directions. Soon, I found myself fully relying on it and trusting its every word. Until that night, on the preceding crossroad, continue straight, I'd been driving for 2 hours, and irritation was beginning to spike in me as an exit was still nowhere in sight. Unusual for my beloved GPS, to the point I began to believe it was busted. But upon examining it, it seemed to be functioning well. I then considered the possibility that maybe it had mistakenly taken a longer route. But as the roads grew narrower and my surroundings became more darker than I thought possible, I soon concluded that it was leading me further into the forest than away from it. On the preceding crossroad, turn right, I sighed and began to slowly spin my steering wheel to the right. I was almost at my wit's end and contemplating whether to just head back and find my own way out, when I soon found out that the GPS's instruction hadn't ended yet. Crackling through the GPS speaker came a deep, hushed voice unlike its usual robotic one. And feed me. I slammed the brakes instantly, jolting forward in my seat, and nearly smashing my head off the dashboard as my car came to a sudden, violent halt. At first, I thought someone had snuck into my car and whispered into my ear from the back seat due to how unfamiliar and close the voice sounded. So, I frantically looked around my car for the perpetrator, until eventually pinning it to the GPS. I soon glanced forward through my windshield and registered what was stood in front of my car. Darkness. That may sound obvious. Of course there would be darkness, it was night. But this darkness was not your average sort, not the sort you can shine a light at to make it dissipate. No, this darkness was absolute and foreign. Like it had a form, despite it being just the absence of light. Like it was an ocean of oil, but with none of the shine or glint it usually holds. The hue of my headlights just sunk into its towering form as I gazed at it with a deep, primal sense of dread boiling in my stomach, like I was prey to whatever was in front of me. If I hadn't slammed my brakes in that moment, I would have most surely drove head-on into that darkness that blocked the road. What I did next was idiotic in hindsight, but I suppose incomparability makes you more primed for investigation. Despite any flashing warning signs there may be, I got out of my car. My loafers thudded against the tarmac road as I approached the darkness. I stopped a few inches away from it, not that foolish to make contact with it. I stared into that vast sea of blackness that filled my view as I tried my best to understand what it was I was looking at. Then I felt it, a breeze. Not unusual for a cold January night, of course, but it wasn't a cold breeze, it was quite the opposite. Hot, parched, overwhelming to the point I had to choke back bile from shooting up my throat onto the road. It took me a few seconds to process what it truly was that just wafted onto me, as it was no breeze. It was a breath. The darkness was breathing on me. Feed me. I heard the GPS demand from back in my car, this time louder and angrier, animalistic even. My fight or flight response instantly kicked in. Immediately I raced back to my car seat, slamming the door behind me as I began to frantically reverse back the way I came. Feed me. Demands began to tumble out of the GPS's speaker in an unbroken, slurred chain. It almost sounded desperate as it did hateful, as I backed up down the road, taking the occasional hazardous glance forward. The darkness didn't move. I don't think it even could, but it did protest. Feed me. Feed me. Feed me. Feed me. I retraced my tracks as the demands became deafening to the point I grasped the GPS and tossed it out the window. Yet the demands continued, but through the radio this time, and with more howling voices joining the crescendo of desperate demanding. Feed US. Feed US. Feed US. Feed US. With my head twisted around as I maneuvered backwards, I could see that down at least one road at each crossroad, there was that familiar darkness. Fear gripped me so badly in that moment, I thought that my heart may fail. I recklessly swerved around the corners of each crossroad I encountered, each time in the opposite direction of the dark. Feed US. I back-ended the occasional tree trunk and almost nearly swerved into a couple ditches, but I kept moving. Until eventually, I found myself in the car park of a 24/7 diner. Exhausted, I think I fell asleep upon finding a parking spot. As I began to doze off, I heard my radio crackle out a few words before I fell into a deep slumber. So hungry, so cold, so alone. Lost, lost, lost. Feed US. It's been 2 weeks since then, and I haven't been back to visit my daughter. As far as I am concerned, I'm not stepping foot into those woods ever again. I could hardly gather up the courage to leave during the day upon waking up in that parking lot. I informed my daughter about what had happened and sent photos of my busted taillights and scratched rims. But I can tell she doesn't really believe me. She probably thinks I've reached that age where I've begun to lose myself, and that very well may be the case. But recently, I decided to do a bit of digging into the road network I was traveling that night. And from what I've gathered, 11 people have went missing in those woods last year alone. But that's not what frightens me. What scares me far more than the fact they disappeared is how they all have one thing in common. Each texted a family member one word before they were never heard from again. Lost. I never believed the stories about the Silverbrook Bridge. People in town whispered about strange things happening there. Cars breaking down for no reason, shadowy figures glimpsed through the trees, a feeling of being watched from the cliffs above. A few people swore they saw something huge lurking near the bridge late at night, but when pressed for details, their voices would lower, and their eyes would dart away, as if speaking of it too openly would call it back. I thought it was all superstition. I wanted to believe that, until the night I found out the truth. It was mid-November when my friend Danny called, his voice tight with panic. "Josh," he said, "something's following me." I frowned. "What are you talking about?" "I don't know, man. I was driving past Silverbrook Bridge and..." His breath came in short, frantic bursts. "There was something in the road. It moved when I swerved, like it knew where I was going. It was too big to be a deer. I don't know what it was. You probably just saw a shadow." No, his voice was sharp, desperate. It was real. It had. He stopped himself. "Never mind. Just meet me at the gas station, okay?" Then the line went dead. I grabbed my jacket and keys, trying to shake the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. Danny looked pale when I got there, his hands trembling around a half-empty coffee cup. "I'm not crazy," he muttered before I even sat down. "I know what I saw." "Then tell me." He hesitated. "It was tall, at least 7 feet. It was wrong. Its limbs were too long. Its eyes," he swallowed. "They glowed red, Josh. Bright red." I felt a flicker of something cold settle in my gut. "Look, man," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Maybe it was just an animal. A trick of the light. Your headlights." Danny slammed his coffee cup down. "No. You don't get it. It was watching me." He exhaled sharply, running a shaking hand through his hair. "And I think it followed me here." I turned my head toward the window, my breath hitching. The fog had thickened outside, curling around the streetlights in long, ghostly tendrils. The street beyond was empty, but for the first time, I felt it too. That terrible sensation of being watched. I should have left it alone. I should have told Danny to go home, get some rest, and forget the whole thing. But instead, I let him convince me to drive back to the bridge. "I need to know," he said. "I need to see if it's still there." And like an idiot, I agreed. The road leading to Silverbrook Bridge was lined with gnarled trees, their bare branches twisting like skeletal fingers. The further we drove, the denser the fog became, until the headlights barely cut through it. Danny was gripping the dashboard, so hard his knuckles had gone white. "This is where it happened," he whispered. I slowed the car. The bridge loomed ahead, its rusted metal frame half lost in the mist. Then the headlights caught something, a dark shape, crouched on the railing. My heart hammered against my ribs. It was big, too big. At first, I thought it was a man, but no man had limbs like that, long, unnaturally thin. And no man could move like that, because the second the light touched it, the figure unfolded, standing upright in one impossibly fluid motion. That's when I saw them. The eyes. Two burning red orbs, staring straight at us. Danny made a sound, a half-strangled cry. "Oh God!" The thing tilted its head, as if it was studying us. Then, before either of us could react, it leapt. Not down. Up. It spread something wide, something vast and black that swallowed the light. And then it was gone, vanishing into the fog above the bridge, leaving nothing but the pounding of our hearts and the echo of the wind. Danny was breathing fast, his hands shaking violently. "Did you see?" "Yes." We didn't speak after that. I turned the car around and drove back to town, both of us too shaken to say another word. Neither of us ever went back to Silverbrook Bridge. But sometimes late at night, when the sky is heavy with mist, I dream of glowing red eyes staring at me from the darkness. Watching. Waiting. The sky turned red at 9:42 a.m. I was on Fifth Avenue, coffee in hand, when the first ripple of sound reached us. It wasn't a boom or a crash. It was a low, gut-deep vibration that made the air feel too thick to breathe. People stopped, looking around like confused animals before a storm. Then the ground trembled. Windows rattled. The coffee shop behind me spilled customers into the street. Nobody knew what had happened. Phones buzzed with emergency alerts, but they were vague. Global impact event. Seek immediate shelter. Some people ran. Some stood frozen, staring up at the sky like answers might be written there. But there was nothing, just that red haze deepening across the clouds, turning the sun into a dull, bloody smudge. A woman next to me clutched my arm. Is it war?" she asked, her voice trembling. I had no answer. Minutes later, the first shockwave hit. I didn't hear it so much as feel it, like the earth itself had been struck with a hammer. Every car alarm in the city screamed at once. Glass exploded from windows in a shimmering rain. People fell to their knees, clutching their ears. My coffee slipped from my hand as I stumbled back against a taxi. Somewhere, a building groaned like a living thing, steel and concrete protesting the strain. I didn't know it then, but halfway across the world, an asteroid the size of Alaska had plunged into the heart of the Indian Ocean. The impact released energy equivalent to tens of billions of nuclear bombs, vaporizing millions of gallons of water and punching a hole through the Earth's crust. A column of steam, molten rock, and debris shot into the sky, breaching the stratosphere and darkening the sun within minutes. The shockwave traveled through the Earth's mantle, triggering earthquakes that shattered cities from Mumbai to Perth. Entire islands vanished beneath walls of water as tsunamis surged outward, racing faster than jet planes. Indonesia, Sri Lanka, the Maldives, gone within hours. The waves hit the coasts of Africa and Australia next, flooding entire nations before barreling across the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. In New York, thousands of miles from ground zero, we felt the earth shudder beneath our feet. The Hudson River surged beyond its banks, flooding lower Manhattan with icy water and dragging cars and debris through the streets. Bridges groaned under the strain, and the Statue of Liberty vanished behind walls of mist and rain. The moment the first shockwave passed, the streets of New York became chaos. People screamed and ran in every direction, cars collided as drivers panicked, and glass from shattered windows crunched beneath my shoes as I stumbled forward. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. I didn't think, I just moved. Adrenaline carried me through the crowd as if my body had decided to survive before my mind could catch up. Sirens blared from every direction, but their wails blended into the background noise of panic. My phone buzzed again in my pocket, another emergency alert flashing across the screen. Shelter in place. Avoid exposure. Take cover immediately. I remember turning onto a side street to avoid the mass of people flooding Fifth Avenue. The pavement beneath my feet trembled with aftershocks, and somewhere in the distance, a building collapsed with a sound like thunder. Dust and smoke hung in the air, making it hard to breathe. When I finally reached my apartment building, 7 blocks away, it was as if my legs gave out all at once. My breath came in ragged gasps as I fumbled with my keys, hands shaking too hard to grip them properly. Behind me, the distant roar of the Hudson River swelling over its banks echoed through the air. I shoved the door open and staggered inside, slamming it shut behind me as if that thin piece of wood could keep the world out. The stairwell was dark, the power had already gone out, and I had to climb 6 flights of stairs by the faint glow of my phone's flashlight. Every step echoed like a countdown, each breath fogging the air as the building's temperature dropped. When I finally reached my apartment and locked the door behind me, I stood in the silence and let the weight of everything hit me all at once. My pulse pounded in my ears, and my hands wouldn't stop shaking. Outside the window, the city burned beneath a sky that no longer belonged to us. And that's when I realized, the world as we knew it had ended. But I was still here. Then rain came as I watched from my window. Thick and black, carrying ash and pulverized rock from halfway across the world. By nightfall, the fires had begun. Molten debris, hurled into space by the impact, rained down across the globe like falling stars. Forests ignited from Siberia to the Amazon. Cities burned as flaming stones crashed through rooftops and shattered glass towers. Smoke and ash choked the skies, blotting out the moon and turning night into a suffocating, endless twilight. The days that followed were a blur of fear and desperation. The air grew colder as the sun disappeared behind a veil of dust and soot. Crops withered in the fields, and animals starved or suffocated as the world entered a nuclear winter. Cities fell silent as their people fled or died. Governments collapsed. Communications failed. By the 3rd week, New York had become a city of shadows. The streets were filled with abandoned cars and the distant echoes of footsteps that never seemed to come close. Fires burned unchecked, their smoke mixing with the ever-present ash that fell from the sky. Somewhere in the distance, the Hudson River continued to rise, fed by storms that never seemed to end. The air smelled of salt and decay, and each breath burned my throat. I rationed what food I had, conserving cans of soup and crackers like they were gold. Water was harder to come by. The taps had stopped running within days, and the bottled supply in my apartment wouldn't last forever. I collected rainwater when I could, filtering it through makeshift cloth screens to catch the ash and grit that fell from the sky. Nights were the worst. Without power, the world outside my window became a void of blackness, broken only by the distant flicker of fires still smoldering in the city's ruins. The silence was so deep it felt alive, broken only by the occasional distant crack of collapsing buildings, or the howling wind that carried the distant echoes of sirens and screams. I slept in fits and starts, huddled beneath blankets and coats as the temperature inside the apartment plummeted. The cold seeped into my bones, and I woke each morning with frost clinging to the glass and the ache of hunger gnawing at my stomach. Still, I held on. It's been a year now. New York is a city of ghosts. Most of its people are gone, lost to hunger, sickness, or the long, silent sleep that comes when the cold becomes too much to bear. Those of us who remain live like shadows, scavenging through the frozen ruins, our breath fogging the air as we huddle against the endless night. The fires have long since burned out, leaving only blackened shells of buildings and streets choked with ash and debris. Snow falls year-round now, gray and heavy, carrying the taste of smoke and iron. The air is thin, and each breath feels like pulling ice into my lungs. I've stopped keeping track of the days. The sun still rises somewhere beyond the clouds, but its light is weak and distant, casting only a faint, dim glow that barely touches the earth. Sometimes, when the clouds break, I look up at the sky and wonder if anyone else is still out there, or if we're all just waiting for the last ember of humanity to flicker out. I don't know how this ends, but when it does, I hope the earth remembers us not for how we died, but for how long we tried to hold on. Note, on the way home tonight, my girlfriend and I were driving back from a friend's house. The sun had just finished setting, and something big, furry and black leapt from a ditch in front of our car. My girlfriend hit the brakes, but not in time as whatever it was rolled under our car. We came to a stop, and I got out of the car to look for whatever it was she hit, but it was gone. There was tracks where it came out of the ditch, but no tracks anywhere showing where it went. There was no blood or fur stuck anywhere on the car. It seems to have just disappeared, and so when we got home I wrote this story. Hope you all enjoy it. The Big Black Dog. It was a quiet evening, the kind that only a country road could offer. The sky was painted in soft orange hues, the sun beginning its descent behind the trees. Julia, an animal lover, was driving home after a long day at the shelter, her car humming along the winding, forgotten back road. She often found peace here, away from the bustle of the city, and tonight, she was savoring the solitude. But then, out of nowhere, it appeared. A massive black dog, almost unnatural in its size, darted across the road in front of her. Julia slammed on the brakes, the car screeching to a halt just as the dog collided with the front bumper. Her heart dropped. She quickly threw the car into park and jumped out, adrenaline coursing through her veins. "Oh no, no, no," she muttered, rushing toward the dog that now lay motionless on the gravel. The dog was large, its fur sleek and dark like midnight, and it was as if it weighed more than it should. But as she knelt beside it, she saw the shallow rise and fall of its chest. It was alive. Relieved, Julia reached for her phone to call for help, but before she could press a single number, the dog's eyes snapped open. Its pupils were completely black, no trace of white to be seen. It lunged at her with unnatural speed, sinking its teeth into her leg. The pain shot through her like lightning, and with a scream, she shoved the dog away, her phone slipping from her hand and clattering to the ground as she fell back. Desperately, she scrambled to her feet, but the beast was already up, its growl echoing through the trees. Without thinking, Julia turned and ran into the woods that bordered the road. She could hear the dog's heavy footsteps pounding behind her, each one getting closer, faster. Branches scraped at her arms and legs as she pushed through the underbrush, her breath ragged, but the dog never slowed. It didn't make sense. The dog was too large, too fast, too relentless. And each time she thought she had outrun it, or somehow stunned it, the dog would rise again, more enraged than before. Julia's heart raced as she glanced over her shoulder. The dog was closer now, its massive body emerging from the shadows like a ghost, its growl low and menacing. She darted left, hoping to throw it off, but the dog followed without hesitation. It was impossibly fast, snapping at her heels, its black eyes glowing with fury. She stumbled, her foot catching on a root, and before she could regain her balance, the dog was on her. It leaped into the air, knocking her to the ground with bone-crushing force. The air left her lungs in a sharp gasp. She struggled, kicking at the creature, but its jaws were locked around her leg, and every movement felt like it was pulling her deeper into the nightmare. With a burst of panic-fueled strength, Julia grabbed a jagged rock from the forest floor and swung it at the dog's head. It connected with a sickening thud, the dog yelping and releasing her leg. For a brief moment, Julia thought she had won. The dog staggered back, a deep gash now visible on its forehead, blood dripping from the wound. It seemed dazed, disoriented. But then something unnatural happened. The dog's body twitched, and the wound on its head began to heal, skin knitting back together at an alarming rate, the gash disappearing before her eyes. The black eyes fixed on her once again, filled with a primal fury. It growled low and deep, and Julia's stomach turned. It charged. She screamed and bolted toward the road, not daring to look back. Her heart hammered in her chest, her breath coming in desperate gasps. Branches lashed at her skin as she ran, her body aching, but there was no time for pain. The sound of the dog's claws scraping against the earth was deafening, always right behind her. Just as she thought she was losing her lead, she glanced back and saw it. The dog was limping, its shoulder twisted at an odd angle, yet it was still gaining ground, almost as though it wasn't even injured. With every step, the wound from the rock was closing, and the dog was moving faster, angrier. She pushed herself harder, hearing the deep, guttural growl growing louder. The sound of the dog's claws raking against the dirt filled her ears, making it seem like the ground itself was coming alive beneath her feet. She broke through the tree line and saw her car ahead. It was so close. Almost there. She reached it, slamming the door shut behind her, fumbling for the keys as she started the engine. The car jerked forward, tires screeching as she sped down the road, her eyes locked on the rearview mirror. At first, the road was empty. No sign of the beast. Her heart began to slow, the terror slowly receding. But then her stomach dropped. The dog was behind her, running, its eyes black as night. The gash on its head was gone, and the limp was nothing more than a memory. It was faster now than it had been before, its massive form a shadow in the fading light. Julia's knuckles turned white on the steering wheel, her foot pressed hard on the gas. She didn't dare look away from the mirror as she sped faster, the dog's silhouette growing larger with each passing second. No matter how fast she drove, no matter how far she went, it was always there, closing in on her, chasing her down the road. The sun sank lower and lower, until the last sliver of light disappeared. As the sky grew darker, the dog's form seemed to dissolve into the shadows. Its black eyes blinked out, fading into the night. For a moment, it seemed as if the dog itself had vanished, swallowed whole by the darkness. Julia's pulse slowed, her breath steadied, but the chill in the air was still there. She glanced back into the rearview mirror, scanning the road. The dog was gone, but just as she thought it was over, she saw it, a fleeting shadow in the distance, faster than the car, gaining on her again. The dog had never truly stopped running. The darkness was its ally now. The flight attendant's voice crackled through the overhead speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard Delta Airlines Flight 2978, bound for Atlanta with continued service to Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport." Her words blurred behind the sounds of shuffling shoes and creaking luggage as Lars and I entered the plane. A flight attendant stood sentry at the cockpit door. Coral pink lipstick bled slightly at the corners of her mouth, as if she'd bitten into a waxy strawberry. She thrust slips of paper into each passenger, who passed her with the rhythm of an assembly line. My turn came, she handed me the paper, and I took it without really thinking about it. Lars squinted at it. "What's that?" "I don't know," I muttered, running my thumb over the raised typeface. We made our way down the aisle, past rows of fraying headrests and sticky armrests. Our seats were illuminated by a flickering overhead light. Lars hoisted our luggage into the bin above, the metal hinges groaning under the weight. I unfolded the paper as I sat into my seat. "Close your windows, and do not look out of them once the plane reaches 30,000 feet. The words stared up at me, stamped in dark, heavy ink. "What the heck?" Lars dropped into his seat beside me, his knees jutting into the aisle. "What is it?" I handed it to him. His calloused fingers grazed mine as he took it. He squinted his eyes. His smirk faltered for a moment before he let out a rough snort. "Huh, that's weird. Maybe it's some kind of prank," I whispered. Lars shrugged and tossed the paper onto his tray table, where it slid to the edge. "Maybe. That's a weird prank, though." He leaned back, arms crossed. The overhead speakers hissed, the flight attendant's voice brittle. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are now preparing for pushback. Please ensure your seat belts are fastened and all personal belongings are stowed securely." The cabin lights dimmed, leaving only the yellow glow of the runway lamps bleeding through the windows. The engines whined, sending vibrations through the floor. The plane lurched backward, wheels bumping over seams in the concrete. I pressed my forehead to the cold plexiglass, watching the gate shrink into the distance. Lars flipped a page in his copy of Slaughterhouse-5, the spine crackling faintly. We pivoted onto the runway as the engines roared. My spine pressed into the seat, acceleration pinning me backward. The wheels left the ground with a shuddering jolt, and for a moment we hung weightless, suspended in limbo, before gravity dragged us back into place. The speaker clicked. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are nearing 24,000 feet. Please begin closing your windows." Lars snorted without looking up from his book. "They're really taking this prank all the way." I laughed nervously and pulled the window shade down. It stuck, the plastic biting into my fingers before snapping shut with a loud click. Around us, a scattered symphony of clicks followed, some sharp, others hesitant. A teenager across the aisle giggled into his hand, while a woman in a pinstripe blazer muttered curses in German as she struggled with her shade. "I guess everyone got that paper," I said, tugging at a loose thread on my sleeve. Lars glanced around the cabin. "Yeah, I guess so." He thumbed the corner of his book, creasing the page. The speakers crackled again. "We have now reached cruising altitude at 30,000 feet. Keep your windows closed, and do not look out of them for the remainder of this flight." Silence hung over the cabin, thick and uneasy, before murmurs broke out. A man 2 rows ahead shouted, "Why can't we look out the window?" His voice carried a Brooklyn edge. A college girl whispered to her seatmate, clutching her phone. Near the galley, a flight attendant stood frozen, her face blank, hands gripping a serving cart. Outside, the plane thrummed, its engines howling into the void of the night. The cabin had settled into a low hum, engines droning, headphones leaking faint action movie sound effects, when light began to bleed through the windows. At first, it was a faint glow, like a match held to the edge of a photograph. But it grew, pulsing with a sickly orange hue, like rust or smog-dimmed streetlights. I pulled off my headphones. The superhero movie on the seatback screen was now bathed in the strange light. Lars turned toward our closed window, his face tinged in that strange glow. "Maybe we're passing through a thunderstorm," he said. "Then where's the thunder?" I shot back. There was no thunder. No rain. Just the steady purr of the plane. "Yeah, that's weird," Lars muttered, chewing his thumbnail, a habit he'd tried to quit. "Screw the prank, just take a look." Before I could answer, movement caught my eye. On the opposite side of the plane, one row ahead, a man in a rumpled flannel shirt had cracked his window open and looked out of it. Light spilled into his row, pooling in the aisle. His face went slack, jaw hanging as if he'd forgotten how to hold an expression. Then he smiled, gums glistening, eyes wide and unblinking. There's a city above the clouds," he rasped, as his gaze stayed locked onto the window. His voice was wrong, guttural, sing-song sounding. He repeated it over and over, each time flatter, emptier. "There's a city above the clouds. There's a city above the clouds." A man in a Patagonia vest sprang from his seat, brimming with misplaced confidence. "Sir, are you all right?" He grabbed Flannel Shirt's shoulder and gave him a shake. No response. Just that frozen smile and the same words. The Patagonia man leaned closer, glancing out of Flannel Shirt's window to see what he was staring at, and froze. His grip tightened on Flannel Man's shoulder, knuckles turning white. Then he started to smile. It spread slowly, like syrup dripping over glass. His back arched unnaturally, his spine bending until tendons popped in his neck. "There's a city above the clouds," they chanted together, their voices twisting into a discordant hymn. Around us, murmurs turned to panic. "What the hell is wrong with those guys?" someone shouted. "Is this the prank?" I stared at our window. The strange light pulsed, each beat in sync with my racing heart, shadows flickering across Lars's face. My hand hovered near the shade. It felt warm. Lars's leg bounced uncontrollably, hammering the seat in front of him. His fingers dug into the armrests, the plastic creaking under his grip. "I really hope this is a prank," he whispered, his voice frayed and raw. A flight attendant appeared at the front galley, her navy blue uniform starched to perfection. She stared at the scuffed aisle carpet, her lips moving silently. "There's a city above the clouds. There's a city above the clouds." The men's voices had dulled to a low drone, less human now, more like the grinding of an engine choking on bad fuel. The orange light clung to their skin, giving them the waxy sheen of mannequins under harsh fluorescence. The attendant stopped beside them, her hands trembling. She grabbed the window shade and yanked it down with such force that the plastic handle snapped off in her palm. The crack echoed like a gunshot. When the window closed, both men collapsed. Flannel Shirt slumped sideways in his seat, saliva pooling in his open mouth. Patagonia vest hit the aisle face first with a wet crunch of cartilage. His smile didn't fade, it melted, his features slackening into something grotesque. Then the blood came. It oozed from his tear ducts, thick and tar-like in the orange light. It crawled down his cheeks in branching patterns, like rivers on a foreign map. He sucked in a gurgling breath, the sound wet and clogged, and exhaled a death rattle that reeked of copper and burnt hair. The attendant stepped over his body without a glance, her polished loafer leaving a faint smear on his sleeve. The cabin erupted into chaos. A woman screamed, a high, keening wail. A teenager vomited into the aisle. In 10C, a man screamed, "What the fuck just happened to them?" while his wife rocked back and forth, whispering asterisk no. Then something tapped on our window. It was delicate, almost polite, like a fingernail brushing glass. My lungs seized. "What the hell?" I whispered. Something from outside spoke. "I'm free now. Open your window. It's beautiful here. There's a city above the clouds." Every hair on my body stood on end. Lars wrapped his arms around me. I buried my face in his shirt, the faint scent of detergent mixing with my tears as they streaked down my cheeks. Windows began snapping open on their own, sharp, mechanical clicks as the shades shuddered upward. A man 3 rows back screamed as his window jolted halfway open, orange light spilling onto him. Our window opened fully for a second, and I slammed my palm down on the shade. I kept my head dropped to avoid looking out of it. I strained to keep it shut, muscles burning, tendons taut. The plastic bit into my skin, but I didn't let go. 1 row ahead, the college girl's window shot open with a crack, sharp as a bone breaking. She and her seatmate turned toward it, reflex overriding survival, and froze. Their faces contorted, lips peeling back unnaturally, gums glinting in the glow. Their voices, flat and mechanical, spoke in unison. "There's a city above the clouds." Clicks of windows opening filled the cabin as others joined in. Their voices tangled into a dissonant chorus, monotone yet feverish, like a prayer murmured by sleepwalkers. I squeezed my eyes shut, pressing my cheek into Lars's shoulder. His shirt reeked of sweat and salt, the fabric damp where my tears pooled. His arms trembled violently, but his grip was unrelenting. The plane plummeted. My stomach shot into my throat, the drop sudden and brutal, like a guillotine blade. My eyes flew open. The cabin was pitch black, the orange glow extinguished as though snuffed out by an unseen hand. For a few agonizing seconds, we were weightless, suspended in silence. Then the overhead lights flickered on. The speakers buzzed with startling calm. "All right, ladies and gentlemen, we've reached Atlanta, Georgia, and will begin landing shortly. We've descended below 30,000 feet, so passengers, you may now open your windows." Outside, Atlanta's runway lights shone through the windows, ordinary and yellow, but no one moved to open their shades. The dead sat among us, frozen in their final poses. Flannel shirt's head lolled back at an unnatural angle, his throat stretched like a pale root ripped from the earth. Patagonia vest lay sprawled in the aisle, his eyes clouded and lifeless. The college girl's smile lingered grotesquely, her lips cracked at the corners, teeth glinting, flecked with blood. The plane jolted as the wheels touched the asphalt, the groan of brakes reverberating through the seats. A collective gasp rippled through the cabin, followed by the metallic snick of seatbelts unlatching. People surged into the aisle, their movements frantic but disturbingly quiet. Lars's grip on my arm was unrelenting, his fingers digging into my skin hard enough to leave bruises. He dragged me forward, our shoes sticking to something wet in the aisle. I didn't look down. We passed the flight attendant near the galley. Her once pristine bun was now a mess of flyaways, her coral lipstick smeared across her chin. She trembled as she stood there, her smile stretched unnaturally wide, tears cutting streaks through her foundation. "Thanks for flying with us," she rasped, her voice broken by hitching sobs. "We found a cheap motel that night. The faux wood paneling warped along the walls, and the bedspread scratched our skin like burlap soaked in cigarette smoke. Lars and I lay tangled in the lumpy twin bed, our shivers sinking into a single, uneven tremor. The TV buzzed, a battered cathode ray relic with a spiderweb crack splintering its screen. A local news segment flickered on. The reporter's voice was thin and strained as he stood in front of Atlanta's airport, his oversized suit flapping in the wind. Behind him, our Delta plane loomed under harsh industrial lights. Men in hazmat suits swarmed the tarmac, their respirators fogging with every breath as they hauled bodies on sleds, the kind used to move meat in slaughterhouses. Flannel shirt's corpse slid into a black van first, his limp arm striking the doorframe with a thunk. The van had no license plate, no markings, just a matte black finish that swallowed the light like a void. The reporter kept talking, his words unraveling into gibberish as the camera zoomed in, too close. A hazmat worker lunged into frame, gripping the reporter's shoulder with a gloved hand. The microphone slipped from his grip and bounced on the asphalt, screeching feedback through the motel's tinny speakers. The camera jerked, catching a brief glimpse of the van's gaping interior, before tilting skyward as someone stepped on it. Seconds later, the screen cut to static. Then, softly, Lars began to speak. "There's a city above the clouds," he murmured. My blood turned cold when I remembered. When our window opened for that fleeting second, Lars had looked out. For years, Bigunkador railway station stood in eerie silence, swallowed by creeping vines and the whispers of those who feared it. It wasn't the passage of time that had abandoned it, nor a lack of passengers. It was something else, something that sent chills through the spines of those who once dared to pass through. It all started in the late 1960s. The station was small, isolated, just another forgotten stop in the middle of nowhere. Trains came and went, but few people ever got off. The station master, a young man new to the job, had heard the whispers of a ghost, but he laughed them off. Ghosts weren't real. The village was just full of superstitious fools. One night, as he sat in his dimly lit office, the rhythmic ticking of the clock was the only sound accompanying him. Then the silence was broken, the unmistakable crunch of gravel outside. Slow, uneven. Thinking it was a late passenger, he grabbed his lantern and stepped onto the platform. That's when he saw her. A woman in a white sari stood at the far end of the station, just beyond the reach of his lantern's glow. Her long hair hung over her face, her posture unnaturally still. He called out, his voice hesitant. No response. Then she moved. Not a normal step, more like a glide, too smooth, too unnatural. The air turned cold. The lantern flickered. A shiver crawled up his spine. He tried to move, to back away, but some invisible force kept him rooted to the ground. And then, just like that, she vanished. They found him the next morning, slumped in his office chair, eyes wide open in a frozen scream. No wounds, no signs of struggle, just terror etched into his lifeless face. The station was shut down that same week. For 42 years, no train stopped there. No passengers waited on its crumbling platform. The building stood as a ghost of its former self, windows shattered, the roof sagging, tracks buried under a layer of rust and weeds. No one dared to go near it after dark. Even during the day, an eerie stillness lingered, like the place was holding its breath. But travelers passing through at night, they knew. Some claimed they saw a woman standing on the empty platform, her gaze following their train as it thundered past. Others swore she ran alongside them, barefoot, her figure flickering between the shadows, moving at an impossible speed. But no one ever stopped. When the government decided to reopen the station in the early 2000s, the villagers protested. They warned of the deaths, the disappearances, the things that lurked where they shouldn't. But officials dismissed their fears, calling them nothing more than outdated superstition. The station reopened. For a while, nothing happened. The stories became whispers, then rumors, then almost forgotten. But fear doesn't die, it only waits. Passengers waiting for the last train of the night spoke of footsteps echoing behind them, though when they turned, they found nothing but empty air. Railway workers reported a woman standing by the tracks, only for her to vanish the moment they blinked. One night, a train conductor swore he saw her on the tracks. He pulled the emergency brakes, heart pounding in his chest. The train screeched to a halt. The crew rushed out, expecting the worst. But there was nothing. No body. No footprints. Just silence. To this day, Bigunkador railway station remains open, though few dare to linger. Some say she was a woman who met a tragic end on those very tracks, her soul trapped between two worlds. Others believe the station itself is cursed, a place where something far older, far darker, still lingers. But if you ever find yourself there alone in the dead of night, and you hear footsteps behind you, don't turn around. There were rumors about this hidden Greek temple, forgotten by time, said to guard a treasure of unimaginable value. Being there, I wasn't sure what I expected to find: gold, jewels, maybe some ancient artifact. But what I discovered was something far more terrifying. It was her. She appeared out of the shadows, and I froze. She was massive, easily 15 feet tall, and unlike anything I'd ever seen. Her body shimmered as though she'd just risen from the depths of the sea, droplets of water clinging to her skin. A sheer, transparent cloth draped over her like a second skin, accentuating her otherworldly form. She looked like a siren from myth, but there was something wrong, something that made my stomach twist in fear. Her eyes locked onto mine. They were filled with longing, desperate, aching, and for a moment I couldn't move. Then she whispered something soft and haunting, a sound that sent chills down my spine. Before I could process what was happening, she moved. She was fast, far faster than anything that size should be. Her massive steps echoed through the temple as she came after me, her gaze fixed on me like I was the only thing that mattered in the world. My instincts kicked in, and I ran. The temple was a maze of crumbling stone and shadowy corridors, but I didn't have time to think about where I was going. All I knew was that she was behind me, her presence suffocating and relentless. This wasn't just a chase, it felt personal. She wanted me, needed me. I turned a corner sharply, and that's when it happened. Her wrist grazed one of the jagged blades jutting out from the temple walls, ancient traps meant to keep intruders like me away. It was barely a scratch, but what spilled from the wound stopped me in my tracks. Her blood wasn't red, it was blue, a glowing, ethereal shade that shimmered like liquid starlight. It dripped onto the floor with a hiss, eating through the stone like acid. The sight of it mesmerized me for a moment. It was beautiful and horrifying all at once. But she didn't stop. If anything, she became more frantic. Her eyes were wide with sorrow now, tears streaming down her face like rivers of molten silver. Her cries echoed through the temple, a a mournful wail that made my chest ache even as fear drove me forward. I ran harder, but she stayed close behind me. Another blade caught her arm as she reached for me again, opening another wound. More of that glowing blue blood poured out, sizzling as it hit the ground and casting an eerie light on the walls around us. The air grew thick with its sharp scent, and my lungs burned as I pushed myself to keep going. Then she stumbled. Her massive form wavered before collapsing to the ground with a thundering crash. She let out a cry, a sound so raw and full of pain that it stopped me in my tracks again. Her shoulders shook as she sobbed, her tears pooling on the floor in shimmering puddles of light. I should have kept running. I wanted to keep running, but something about her sorrow rooted me in place. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was something else: guilt, pity, whatever it was. I couldn't leave her like this. Cautiously, I approached her fallen form. She didn't lash out or try to grab me this time. She just looked up at me with those haunting eyes full of pain and longing. Up close, her desperation was overwhelming. It felt like it could swallow me whole. Her arm was still bleeding that glowing blue liquid, and I knew she wouldn't survive much longer if it didn't stop. Acting on instinct more than anything else, I reached for the wound and carefully exposed what lay beneath her skin. A strange object embedded deep within her flesh. It wasn't natural. It pulsed faintly in my hand like it was alive, radiating an ancient power I couldn't begin to understand. For a moment, I considered keeping it for myself. After all, wasn't this what I'd come for? But as I looked back at her crumpled form, her tears still falling silently, I knew what I had to do. With trembling hands, I pressed the object back into her wound and sealed it as best as I could manage. Her body shuddered violently before going still. Her breathing slowed until it became soft and steady, as if she were finally at peace. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. The temple seemed to exhale around me as I fled into its depths once more, leaving her behind in silence. But even as sunlight finally broke through the ruins above and freedom beckoned me forward, her sorrow lingered in my mind, a weight I couldn't shake. I had come seeking treasure, but left with something far more haunting. The memory of her desperation, and the question that would never stop gnawing at me. Who or what had she been waiting for? And why did it feel like had failed her? When I was a child, 2 railroad tracks ran a short distance from my home. This is the source of an unimportant problem which has been vexing me. The town was sleepy when I was a child, but had been consumed by urban sprawl by the time I was a man. What little appeal the town once had is now dead. Commercial real estate developers, like Mongol hordes, thundered into my village on horseback and cast down our old idols. We swear fealty now to the numerous khans, which is to say, money spent in the town now leaves the town. My friends and family have all left it. It belongs to the strip malls now. The town had been founded in one of those black and white times before anyone I knew called it home. I know little of its history, honestly. I know only of the town between 2003 and 2016. I had begun creating and storing memories around 2003. My human brain can do this for important things like learning to read or complex mathematics, but I have taught it instead to use this gift for useless matters. My first memory was standing next to my bed, which lay parallel to windows looking upon the Needbore's house. I thought, I will remember this. I still do. I'm not good at keeping promises, so I don't know why this one is important to me. The double railroad track which ran by my house also crossed the center of town. It was of such importance, being tied in some way to the town's founding, that it found its way onto the town's seal. The 2 tracks, however, did not both operate. One looked older than the other, and I never saw it used. I suspect that there was something wrong with the older track, or perhaps it fell into disrepair, and it was more cost-effective to construct a second new track right next to it. This has always been my favorite theory. As a teenager, I would often walk to high school along the track, which ran the distance between school and home. I would tend to stick to the older track. Its wood was sun-bleached, and the granite rubble it was built upon had been ground down over the decades. Worse, the new track was coated in some thick and smelly oil. The wood was treated against fire or bugs or something, I suppose. It reminded me of my father's work somewhat, which seemed defined by random smelly chemicals slowly cooking in small pools around buzzing machinery. He did something with oil wells, as most fathers did in the town. The other fathers tended to be more connected, he would explain me, when I asked why all of our stuff seemed a little worse than theirs. Connections are everything, I would come to learn. My father would park his small and dirty truck behind the chrome leviathans of his peers. It brings to mind images of Olympic swimmers next to Olympic gymnasts. Surely these are not members of the same species. "Hey, look," he would remark to the connected man. "Your truck took a shit." One day, walking upon the old track, I was sulking about something. I was a teenager, so I'm sure it was very important. It was due to this, perhaps, that I was feeling rebellious. I was consumed with adolescent fury. I was to show the fakes and phonies, and I would do it by slightly breaking minor rules wherever I found them. My first opportunity presented itself in the form of a train, approaching from behind. Of course, I was on the old tracks and didn't even deign to face the steel leviathan, no matter how liberally the engineer blew the horn at me. I certainly wasn't supposed to be walking on any track, but I was a rebel. I struggled to construct the chain of logic here, years later, because I suspect there wasn't much at the time. As I heard the train's approach from behind me, however, I began to lose heart. The train grew impossibly loud. My teeth rattled against each other, as tons of steel mixed the juices my brain marinated in. It felt as though I was some delicate forest creature in its final and terrible moments, before some great beast snapped its jaws around me whole. I heard a sound of thunder, and every cell in my body screamed at me to move. I got off the track, and the train drove by at a safer distance the engineer probably preferred. At one point, a single mother in the neighborhood was visited in the night by a legless man. He pounded on her door in the dead of night, begging for help as though he was in great danger. She didn't let him in, and he slunk back into the night. My father told me sternly that I was not to walk by those railroad tracks, as the man had been seen camping in the area. I had never been a particularly athletic child, but that warning did hurt. There was something sinister about the older tracks which I could never place. Hearing news of old classmates dying is something I know I will grow used to at some point, but I am too young still to hear the few I have. There was a young man I used to smoke weed with. We would roll it in copy paper or carve pipes out of apples. He was found dead next to the track recently. He had never been quite okay. It was as though he was just borrowing his skin and wasn't used to it. One time, at the tender age of 15, his girlfriend texted him that she was willing to have sex with him. This bold child drove an hour and a half one way. I asked him if it was worth it. He said no. Only locals can tell you where the haunted houses are. There could be one of those cheesy ghost tours in every town, if the commercial real estate developers learn the value of all the old gossip. As things stand, they bulldoze all the haunted houses. The house next to mine was one such candidate. I would tell all the slack-jawed tourists about the story told to me by its owner, a one-legged chain smoker who God thankfully saw fit to give us. Her name was Mrs. Thompson, and she had many redeeming qualities. Among her greatest features was her deeply held belief that her cat, a cranky old ball of black fur named Smokey, had been trained to pee in the toilet by a ghost. This ghost, we all knew for certain, was the wife of the previous owner. An eccentric tattooed man we all called Cricket. He had 2 sons my age which my brother and I would play with. This is the only story I know of the town's history. Cricket's wife killed herself on the railroad track when I was too young to know her. She lay down upon the same tracks which I walked to school on. I am not trying to disparage her memory when I say that she must have been wildly drunk. I don't know how else she could bear the sound of thunder. I forget in what way this was connected to Smokey's exceptional bathroom habits. The house Mrs. Thompson lived in, I can confirm, was haunted. As a boy, in the room I shared with my brother, our bedroom window faced the house directly. In the leaves of a few young trees which separated our 2 homes, I could make out a face. It troubled me greatly when I tried to sleep. I told my dad of it at length, and he eventually would cut it down at my request. It was a small enough tree anyway. The face, I insisted, could only been seen with the lights out and just looked like leaves in the light of day. The face remained after the tree's removal. I would have nightmares of the house as well. Formless and hungry things lived within it. They skittered across its beams and foundation, dancing and giggling beyond the periphery of our vision. These were nightmares unlike any I've had since. Perhaps it was my youthful imagination which I now lack. That ominous and formless evil contrasts strongly with the childish nightmares of my adulthood. The nightmares I have now are cartoonish and simple. My recurring nightmare is that I'm running around on a sheet of ice, and a shark is snapping up at me from beneath the breaking ice. I recently visited the town. I had no reason to, in all honesty. It's not home anymore, and I feel like a ghost when I go there. I saw to my disappointment that the old tracks have been ripped up. Certainly, they had no reason to still be there, and they were far from the first useless old things to be ripped out of that town. I mourned their loss all the same, I told my brother about it when I saw him. His puzzled frown and confused gaze has unsettled me since. What old tracks? I have been a newspaper delivery substitute for over 2 years now. My route is not very long. I am usually busy for 2 hours. We live in a very rural area surrounded by mountains and wooded hillsides. Some houses are built right at the tree line. Wild animals are surprisingly rare here, though I have seen some deer in the woods. Pets are much more common. There are a lot of cats, which is probably why I was not really bothered when these things started happening. Half a year ago, I was distributing the newspaper as always. I reached the last street on my route. 5 houses in one line. The first 3 were pretty new, the 4th was an old shag, owned by an old man, and the last one was a holiday home, usually empty when I was there. When I reached house 2 that day, I was shocked. A dead bird had been left beneath the mailbox. I quickly brushed it off as a cat's prey. Nothing bad, nothing scary, but the bird was not cleaned up. Its corpse stayed on the ground, slowly decaying more and more. I felt sorry for the bird and grossed out. I did not want to touch it. I thought that was the reason the bird was still there. No one wanted to clean it up. Eventually I became numb to it. Now only a few weeks ago I was once again in that street, finishing my tour as I suddenly stopped dead in my tracks. A fish was lying in the driveway of the old shag. Okay, I thought, nothing strange. There is a river nearby, an animal caught it, dragged it up here and left it. Plausible solution. Except that the fish was lying perfectly vertical, as if it had been placed there, and its lower half was missing. Just gone. With a clean cut. Teeth could not do that. But a knife could. So a human must have placed the fish there. Okay, I thought, never mind. I'll mind my own business. I went home and took a shower. Only then did I notice that the fish did not smell bad. On a warm day like this, the fish would have started to rot way too soon. A chill run down my spine as I realized that the fish must have been placed there only minutes before I had entered the street. I closed my curtains tightly that night. It began to give me the creeps, but I kept doing the job. My rational mind kept telling me that everything had a logical explanation, and I was just too scared to see it. Besides, I needed the money. Today I made my rounds again. The road was quiet. No dead animals, nothing. That was until I climbed the stairs to the Holdy home. I put a newspaper into the mailbox and turned around, my gaze washing over the trees. Fear sank into my stomach like a stone. In a tree, not more than 10 feet from me, a deer's head hung from a branch. The flesh had rotted away, leaving nothing but pale bones. My ragged breathing was the only sound. Every bird, every animal, even the wind, had stopped. The empty eyes of the deer's head seemed to dig into my head, my thoughts. Deeper and deeper until they seemed to see everything of me. Everything I ever was. Everything I'll ever be. The sound of breaking wood filled my ears, and the skull fell to the ground. Its magic was broken. I ran home, closed the curtains, and covered myself with the blanket, shivering under the sheet. My sweaty hair clung to my body, and my dirty clothes were far too warm. I tried to breathe. Its eyes were still in my head, and every thought seemed to be watched by them. It took hours before I could move again. I have a feeling that something not natural is happening. Something horrible. I don't want to go back there. I want to keep my curtains closed forever. But I cannot forget those eyes. I am scared. So scared. The gravel, 3 feet below mine, displaces as I sweep above it. Holes scatter the remains of the earth, only leaving a total of 400 square feet of untouched surfaces. I counted. I enter the ruins of a restaurant. There is not a door, not a window, but there remain 2 walls. I approach the counter and rest my hand on it. I relax onto the stool, but it's not comfortable. It frays in almost every edge of it, and the fluff of the cushion is God knows where. I look around the room and see the fluff I was once complaining about. I move my hand to look at it, for it is covered in dust and smog off the surface of the table. I wipe it off onto my leg, which only seems to smear. I force myself to stare at the sun while it burns as a punishment. I could have done more. I should have done more. I would have done more. Could'ves and would'ves and should'ves fill my brain instead of rational thoughts. What was I thinking when I chose to watch? Why didn't I help Max? Why didn't I help Maya? Why didn't I help Alexander? I slam my hand onto the table, still looking upward. The table immediately explodes into an amount of pieces you couldn't even count. Smog and dust completely fills the air around me, which covers my field of view from the sun, giving me a break. I can't help but wish the sun would burn faster. Something is going to finally kill me, but it's taking so long. I've suffered for eons, and the thing that will kill me is taking so long. My eyes start to water, my arm goes weak, my chest starts to hurt. I'm crying, which I don't do. I can't help but to cover my eyes from which the sun has damaged. Immediately I heal, with no blind spot in my eyes. There is no proper punishment for my actions. The sun grows in size and I smile. Finally, I scan the horizon one last time. Most of it is covered in dust and human remains. Husks of skyscrapers rip upwards into the horizon vertically. Cars line the road that was once there. Humans lay in several places on the ground, completely cut up and ripped apart. There's nothing else but I and the sun, which are both going to soon disappear. My fault. The sun grows again, as if it's getting closer. I slowly rise, sun in my eyes and my arms apart. The wet from my eyes evaporate. I could have helped more, there was more to do. There was less to hate. 20 feet, 30 feet, 50 feet, 80 feet, 150 feet. I could have saved countless lives. They were unworthy and abomination. 400 feet, 800 feet, 3,000 feet. I am abomination. 20,000 feet, 60,000 feet. My atoms completely unassigned themselves from me, but my consciousness lays existant and droning. This isn't relief, for it is torture. I see everything it once was and everything it wasn't. Galaxy and void fill my eye, or whatever I use to view. I feel not, but I feel everything. There is no longer something anymore, but only anything. I've felt this before, this is a do-over. I create heaven, and then earth. The earth is without form and void, and darkness become upon the face of the deep. The spirit of I move upon the face of the waters. I open my mouth, and arise let there be light, and there was light. I see the light, and it is good. I choose to part the light from the darkness, and there so be. Genesis 1 verse 3. For years she had lived alone. No husband, no children, just the house, the garden, and the silence. The kind of quiet that wrapped around you like a warm blanket. The mornings were spent in the garden, her garden, where the roses bloomed in clusters of crimson and white. She hummed to herself as she trimmed, water splashing softly onto the earth, the sunlight falling just right between the leaves. And she liked it that way. But lately things hadn't felt quite right. At first, it was just small things. A chair that wasn't quite where she'd left it. A picture frame that seemed to have shifted a few inches. And then the laughter. A child's laughter. It echoed through the halls late at night when everything was still, but she told herself it was just the wind. Just her imagination. But the more she tried to ignore it, the louder it became. One night, the laughter was joined by footsteps. Little feet, light and quick, walking across the old floorboards upstairs. But she had no children. There was only the house, and her. Then came the voices. A man and a woman arguing in a distant room. We should leave. We can't just go. We've spent everything on this house. She pressed her hands to her ears, trying to drown out the sounds that rattled the walls. It wasn't real. It couldn't be real. But the noises only grew louder. One night, after the arguing had become too much to bear, she screamed, "Leave me alone." And just like that, silence. The house went still. For the first time in weeks, the eerie noises stopped. She slept soundly, thinking she had finally rid herself of whatever haunted the house. Until the next morning, when she stepped outside and saw them. A family, a man, a woman, and a child, stood on the front lawn, staring at the house. They were whispering to each other, eyes wide and uneasy. She froze, heart pounding. They could see her. The woman shivered, turning to her husband. "I think this house is haunted." The old woman's breath caught in her throat. She was the house. She was the one who had always lived here. They didn't need to know her. She didn't need to be seen. So they called a psychic. The psychic stood still for a long moment, eyes closed, listening. Then she smiled softly. "She's not haunting the house," the psychic said in a calm voice. "She's part of it." The old woman's heart skipped a beat. What did she mean? She's been here a long time. She doesn't know she's gone. The words echoed in her mind, but they didn't make sense. She was here. She had always been here. Hadn't she? The psychic turned toward the garden, toward the roses that she had tended for so long. "She just loves the garden," the psychic said, her voice soft. The family stared at the garden, unsure of what to make of it. But the child's eyes were wide. She stepped forward, as if drawn by something invisible, and stared into the blooming flowers. And that's when the old woman felt it. Her hand brushed against the window. She hadn't realized she was standing there until the cool glass was pressed against her palm. She looked down at the roses, the laughter, the voices, the moving objects. It had never been the house that was haunted. It had always been her. And as the wind rustled through the garden, the roses swayed with it, whispering softly in the breeze. But this time, the laughter was warm, like an old friend returning after a long absence. The house was hers, and she would always care for it.